Greek and Roman Mythology. Part 1. Myths of the beginning, the heroes, and the afterworld. It may be thou hast followed through the islands some divine bard, by age taught many things, age and the muses, and heard him delighting the chiefs and people in the banquet, and learned his songs of gods and heroes, of war and arts, and people's cities, inland or built by the grey sea. If so, then hail, I honour and welcome thee. Matthew Arnold, The Strayed Rebeller. Greek and Roman Mythology. Chapter 1. Myths of the Beginning. The early Greek looked out upon the world of men and things and asked himself the far from simple question: how and by whom was this great complex created? In answering the question, he was bound, of course, to remain within the limits of his own personal experience, to explain the unknown in terms of the known or of what seemed to be known. Lacking the classified data of our modern sciences of geology, astronomy, and biology, he was as incapable of forming even a vague idea of the structure of the universe as he was of measuring the distance between the sun and the moon. Yet he possessed certain fundamental facts, and these composed his meagre body of science. Moreover, observation had taught him that the world was the theatre of the ceaseless operation of unseen powers that were certainly superior to man. Following his instincts, he personified these powers, called them gods, and did them worship. This constituted his religion. Since among most primitive peoples science and religion tend to be inextricably interwoven with each other, it was inevitable that the Greek should draw on these two sources of his funded experience in answering his question as to the beginning of things. Broadly speaking, the fundamental facts known to the Greek are as follows. In all departments of her activity, nature steadily proceeds from disorder towards order. The great movements generally take place in regular cycles, such as days, months, seasons, and years, while the unforeseen and calamitous phenomena like volcanic eruptions, whirlwind, and flood are really less frequent and less potent than the normal operations. Like tends to beget like. Life arises only from life. The great tree comes from a small seed, the bird from a fragile egg, and man grows to maturity from a helpless infant. What could be more natural for the Greek than to conclude, as he did, that the world and the races of men and of gods came into being in the same way? Once he could account for their creation, he could easily explain their subsequent growth and development through the ordinary visible processes of nature. For the supremacy of gods and men with their ideas of order and justice, he could find an obvious reason in the superiority of the great regular forces over the irregular. In this method of thought, he was unwittingly paying a great tribute to himself. The lower savage accredits some animal with the creation of the world. The more advanced savage might go as high in the scale as man himself in his search for the first maker. But to be able to point with conviction to personal creative forces immeasurably beyond man demands an extraordinary degree of intellectual advancement. The creation of the world. Among the Greeks, there was no single generally accepted account of the creation, for the people were divided as to which of the several records was the most ancient and therefore likely to be the most authoritative. The view that prevailed in Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BC was that the oldest was contained in a poem which passed as the composition of the inspired Orpheus. The many other so-called Orphic poems current at the time were frankly counted as forgeries, but nevertheless were believed to contain the same tradition of the beginning as that found in the Iliad. According to the Orphic story, uncreated Nyx, or night, existed first, and was regarded as a great black-winged bird hovering over a vast darkness without form and void. Though unmated, she laid an egg, whence golden-winged Eros, love, flew forth, while from the two parts of the shell, Ouranos and Gaia, heaven and earth, were created. They became the first pair of parents and brought into the world Okeanos, ocean, and Tethys, nurse. These in their turn became a parental pair, begetting Kronos, Rhea, Phorcys, and the other Titans. And similarly, Kronos and Rhea were united and begat Zeus and Hera. Now Kronos was warned that his reign would cease when Hera should bear a son to Zeus. To forestall such an evil, he sought to kill her, but she was saved by her mother, who secretly brought her to the realm of Okeanos and Tethys, where, unknown to her father, she was wedded to Zeus. The Moirai, or Fates, led the bride to her husband, and Eros drew the bridal car, while in honor of the nuptials, Gaia gave Okeanos permission to fashion the beautiful gardens of the Hesperides. The Orphic poet held this union of Zeus and Hera before the Greeks as the model of conjugal relations. The Hesiodic story is different in many points and is much less satisfactory as a philosophical explanation of beginnings. First there was chaos, the vast, immeasurable abyss, outrageous as a sea, dark, wasteful, wild. Then came Gaia, gloomy Tartaros, the dark underworld, and Eros as the moving force within and about all things. Chaos brought into being Erebos, lower darkness, and Nyx, and these in their turn beget Aether, heavenly light, and Hemera, earthly light, that is, day. Mother Earth bought Ouranos, star-sown heaven, to be a helpmeet to herself, and at the same time a secure dwelling place for the blessed gods. Now appeared the rugged mountains and the wild stretches of the sea. In their relation of husband and wife, Ouranos and Gaia became the founders of what one might call the first royal house of the gods. The regime of Ouranos. The children of Ouranos and Gaia were many. First, there were born the Titans, such as Okeanos, Cryos, Hyperion, Iapetos, Themis, Justice, Mnemosyne, Memory, and last of all, Kronos. Besides these, there were the Cyclops, the power of the air, Brontes, Thunderer, Sterops, lightning, Argus, thunderbolt, each of whom had one huge eye in the middle of his forehead. In addition to these monsters were the giants Kotos, Briaros, and Gais, each with 50 heads and 100 hands springing from his shoulders. So terrible were they that Ouranos, their father, was afraid of them and thrust them back into the bosom whence they had come. At this Gaia was sorely offended, and calling her children together, she laid before them a plan of putting an end to the violence of their sire. Only Kronos was fearless enough to carry it out. With a sickle given him by Gaia, he attacked his father and terribly mutilated him. But Gaia caught the blood from the wound, and from it in the process of time were born the Erinis, Furies, the armed giants, and the Melian nymphs, while the contact of the severed flesh with the sea produced Aphrodite, the goddess of love. With this attack, the rule of Ouranos came to an end. The regime of Kronos. By virtue of his strength and boldness, Kronos assumed the kingship over the gods, whose number was now large, for during the rule of Ouranos, Nyx, Pontos, and the elder Titans had begotten many children, among these being Thanatos, death, his brother Hypnos, sleep, the whole tribe of dreams, Nemesis, friendship, old age, and strife, who herself had brought forth wars and rumors of war. Following the example of Gaia in wedding Ouranos, Rhea became the sister spouse of Kronos, and the fruits of their wedlock were Hera, Hades, or Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus, the sire of gods and men. Kronos, remembering how he had displaced his father, became fearful that one of his children might overthrow him, and accordingly, as soon as they were born, he swallowed them as the easiest way of getting rid of them. Only Zeus escaped, and that because Rhea contrived and executed a plan that he should be born in Crete and hidden in a cave on Mount Aegaeon. Instead of a child, she gave Kronos a stone, which he swallowed in ignorance of the deception, whereupon Gaia caused him to disgorge what he had eaten, and naturally the stone came first and the children last. On reaching manhood, Zeus emerged from his hiding place, and after putting an end to the unjust rule of his father, he wedded Hera, and himself took the throne. Afterwards he deposited the stone in Delphi. Centuries later, a certain meteor worshipped in Roman Africa was identified by mythologists as this same stone. Establishments of the regime of Zeus. The Titans. Many children were born to Zeus and Hera, and they were the first to be properly called gods. They established themselves on Mount Olympus, which stood directly opposite Mount Orthrys, the seat of the Titans, who, being the older race, with the exception of Mnemosyne, Themis, and Prometheus, quite naturally regarded Zeus and his family as upstarts and usurpers. Bitter rivalry and strife arose between the two settlements, and for 10 years they fought with no decisive results. A peace parley held at the end of this period seemed only to add heat to the conflict, so that, at length, Zeus freed the 300-handed giants whom Kronos had left bound deep down within the earth, and enlisted them in his ranks, deciding now to reveal his full strength and to bring the tedious strife to a sudden end. With their many hands the giants hurled huge rocks at the foe until the sky was darkened, while Zeus cast thunderbolt after thunderbolt with their long tongues of flame. Dire was the noise of conflict. Overhead the dismal hiss of fiery darts in flaming volley flew, and flying vaulted either host with fire. By this deadly assault the Titans were overwhelmed and driven into the depths of the earth. Down, down they went, a journey of 9 days and 9 nights, until they were as far from the plains of earth as the plains of earth are beneath the heaven. There a brazen wall with brazen gates was built about them, and the 3 giants were placed on guard to prevent them from escaping. Typhon, or Typhus, the giants. The sway of Zeus was not yet secure, for Gaia had borne to Tartarus a monstrous son, named Typhon, the demon of the whirlwind. Upon his shoulders he carried 100 serpent heads. His voice was like those of all formidable beasts in one. From his eyes there flashed out fire. In his might he assailed Zeus, and would have wrested the sovereignty from him, had not the Lord of the gods leaped down from on high and felled the monster with a thunderbolt. Upon Typhon, Mount Athena was set, and from its peak the smoke and fire of his laboured breathing rise to this very day. Even yet the lordship of Zeus was challenged, this time by the giants who had been born of Gaia by the blood of Ouranos, and whom some believed to be the forefathers of the human race. Among these mighty beings were Enceladus, Hyperbios, Ephialtes, and Polybotes. They were a haughty and warlike folk, and under their king, Eurymedon, they lived, some said, in the island of Kerkyra, or Corfu, or as others preferred, in Spain or even in Chaldlike. For their insolence and hostility, the gods, led by Zeus and Athene, overthrew them. In punishment, volcanoes were piled on their prostrate bodies, and their groans and convulsions of pain can be perceived even today. This myth is a restatement or a poetic imitation of the Battle of the Titans, but it contains several features just as old as the body of the other story. It was a very popular theme in poetry and art throughout the Hellenic world. We find it employed in a vase painting which dates at least as early as the 6th century BC in the eastern metopes of the Parthenon, and in the frieze of the great altar of Zeus at Pergamon. Although the elements of these stories of the beginnings of things are varied and confused, their central meaning is clear. They reveal the belief of the early Greeks that their established social order never could have existed had not the cosmic forces previously been reduced to order by some power or powers. Moreover, they may have regarded as a gauge of the growing Hellenic faculty, which apprehended these potencies at first as few and mutually overlapping in function, and later as many and distinct from one another. In the ascendancy of Kronos over Ouranos and of Zeus over Kronos, we see an increasing appreciation of the worth of intellect over mere brute strength and cunning. In short, the whole fabric of the story sets forth in pattern the conviction that the world moves steadily toward better things. The creation of man. The Greeks, unlike the Hebrews and their religious successors, had no one orthodox account of the creation of man. On the contrary, there were almost as many traditions as there were city-states, and the multiplicity of both was due to the same cause, the isolating character of the Greek highlands. What more natural for the Greek local patriot than to believe that the first man was created in his own community? When one understands the spirit of the divisions in Greece, he cannot wonder that the attempts of Hesiod and the earlier logographers to construct a harmony of the conflicting local myths never proved to be eminently successful. In the legends that we are about to examine, each act of the creation of man follows one of three processes. The man simply originates out of the elemental powers or objects of the earth, or he is begotten by one of the Olympians, or he is molded out of lifeless matter by the hand of some divine or semi-divine artisan. The first process is not as strange as it appears to be at first glance, for it is very easy to infer that the power which can produce the crops of the field and the mysterious second growth of timber on the burnt lands, and can make sudden revelations of life in the wilderness, can also produce man. The Athenians believed that the first man was Cecrops, who sprang to life from the soil of Athens. Those Boeotians who lived near Lake Cropius held that the first man, Alalcomenes, was born of the waters of the lake after the manner of fish. To the people of Arcadia, the first man was their own earth-sprung Pelasgos. In Theban's story, men germinated from the dragon's teeth sown broadcast on the earth. Iacchos, the king of Aegina, had a country without a people until, at the command of Zeus, the ants on the island assumed human shape and became his subjects. Among those Hellenic stocks which inhabited districts of hill and forest, the prevailing myths derived men from rocks and trees. Zeus was accredited with being the great forefather of more families and stocks than was any other Olympian, and his title, Father of Gods and Men, was therefore no idle appellation. He begat Helen through his union with Pyrrha, ruddy earth, who was thus made the foremother of the Hellenes. By Dia, divine earth, he became the father of Peirithous. Iacchos was his son by Aegina, the nymph of the island of the same name. Lake Daimon, the ancestor of the Lake Daimonians, was born to him by Tayget, the nymph of the mountain of that region. Perseus was the issue of his approach to Danae in the form of a shower of gold, and nearly all kings proudly trace their descent to Zeus. Yet the other gods were not wholly without such honors. Poseidon was represented as the great ancestor of the Iolic stock, and Cronos became the father of Cheiron through his amour with Philyra, linden tree. One meets but rarely with myths which attribute the origin of a race to the union of a goddess with a mortal man. It is rather surprising that in most of their cosmogonic myths, the Greeks succeeded merely in setting forth a plausible sequence of events, but failed to make really serious attempts at a real solution of the causes. The stories which we have just noted were not such as to satisfy a truly inquisitive mind. The Greeks themselves early came to a realization of this, and the simple conception rapidly gained ground that the first human being must have been, so to speak, a manufactured product. The maker, or makers, according to the variations of the story, was a god who formed man by a definite act of will, by means of a well-known process, and out of some tangible material. The method which is generally detailed is the very old and simple one of moulding the figure out of the dust of the earth, a concept which appeals to the imagination of the modern as well as of the ancient. In the myths of Prometheus and of Pandora, we shall see it most attractively brought out. Prometheus. Prometheus is the type of the highest perfection of moral and intellectual nature, impelled by the purest and the truest motives, to the best and noblest ends. These words of the poet Shelley give us a clear view of Prometheus in his relation to the thought and religion of the Greeks. He was a paradoxical character. In his one person he was both less than God and more than God, being wise and kind. His figure was clear where it represented the moral aspirations of the Hellenes, obscure where it touched their formal religion. It had just those lines which their imagination could not resist and which made it an inexhaustible literary theme. Prometheus, a forethinker, was generally held to be the son of the Titan Iapetos and Gaia, or Themis, and was the brother of Atlas and Epimetheus, or afterthinker. The legends are by no means in agreement as to the name of his wife, who is variously called Celaeno, Pandora, Pyrrha, Asia, and Hesione, all of which, and it's worth noting, are epithets of the earth goddess. His marriage was fruitful, and among his children were sometimes counted Deucalion, Chimaerus, Aitonios, Io, and Thebe. In many of the myths, Prometheus and Hephaestus are curiously allied in their relations to human culture. Although a Titan, Prometheus had espoused the cause of Zeus, thus manifesting his native sympathy for law and order. But as he was essentially a nobler type than Zeus himself, he could not long maintain the allegiance. When the chief Olympian found mankind hopelessly faulty and planned to create a new race in its place, Prometheus broke with him and defiantly became sponsor of the human cause. This generous devotion is the source of his power in myth. In Hesiod's Theogony, The story runs that a conference of gods and men was held at Sicyon to determine the homage owned by men to the gods. Acting as priest, Prometheus sacrificed an ox and divided it into two parts, one of which consisted of flesh and other edible portions enveloped in the skin of the animal, while the second was composed of bones and entrails alluringly garnished with strips of rich fat. It was the hope of Prometheus that Zeus would be misled by appearances and choose the poorer part. But to the Olympian the deceit was too plain, and, in order that he might have an excuse for punishing men, he deliberately took the bones and entrails, and withheld the gift of fire from men. Moved with pity, Prometheus stole some embers and brought them to mankind hidden in a hollow stalk. In some myths it is said that he took the fire from the very hearth of Zeus, in others from the workshop of Hephaestus and Athene on Lemnos, in still others from the fiery chariot of the sun. Through this sublime theft, men were enabled to lift the ban of Zeus, to begin life anew, and little by little to evolve the arts and crafts. But Prometheus paid the penalty for his trespass on the divine rights of Zeus to the exclusive control of fire. Zeus had him chained to a crag or pillar in the range of Caucasus, and appointed an eagle to gnaw at his vitals, consuming each day what had been restored during the night just past. Despite his many sufferings, the spirit of Prometheus was unquenched, for he was comforted with the foreknowledge that some day he would be released, and that Zeus would be overthrown, even as Uranus and Cronos had fallen. In due time his shackles were broken by Heracles, and he was brought back to Olympus to serve his fellow gods with his gift of prophecy. In one odd version of the story, the rock sank with Prometheus into the gloomy depths of Tartarus. The notion that man was shaped from clay was relatively late. By the 5th century BC, the belief in this process was general, and by the 4th, it was the rule to identify Prometheus as the artist. From clay he fashioned both men and beasts, and into them passed emanations of the divine fire, which became their souls. The human-like boulders at Panopeus in Phokis were pointed out as material left over by him in the process of making men. The myth of Prometheus teaches that Greeks regarded all natural fire as originally divine, that it was at once the strongest and the subtlest of the forces of nature and the most potent factor in the advance of humanity. In the legend can be detected a plea for the dignity of perseverance and toil, and the promise that they will bring their own reward in the form of increased efficiency. The picture of the noble suffering of Prometheus is testimony that very early the Greeks had a clear idea of self-sacrifice. Pandora. By accepting the stolen fire, men were legally party to the offense, and to punish them, Zeus condemned them to earn their daily bread by the sweat of their brow, besides doing them irreparable harm by bringing evil into their lives. At his bidding, Hephaestus shaped an image of clay and endowed it with human faculties. In appearance, the figure was like one of the Olympian goddesses, a beautiful maiden to whom all the Olympians contributed of their several qualities. The Graces and the Hours decked her out in charming apparel and bright flowers, so that desire awoke in the hearts of men. And as the gift of all the gods to the human race, she was named Pandora. Hermes brought her to Epimetheus, who received her in spite of Prometheus's warning to accept nothing from the gods. For, unhappily, it was the nature of Epimetheus to see no evil until it had come upon him. Pandora, curious to know what was stored in a large jar standing near her, fancy is free to conjecture the origin of the vessel, lifted the lid, and before she could replace it, all sorts of evils and diseases flew out and covered land and sea. Only hope was left, not buoyant, reassuring hope, but that kind which is too much mortal woe, so sweet that none may turn from it nor go. Such, in the main, is the story of Hesiod. In the late poets, the jar is said to have contained every good as well as every evil. The former flew away and were lost, while the latter was scattered among men. The substance of this tale and that of the phrase cherchez de la femme are the same. Through woman came and still comes evil into the world. While the advent of the first man was explained in many ways, the first woman was always believed to be the handiwork of the gods. Origins of certain animals and plants. We can here mention only a few of the many passages in the myths which describe the metamorphosis of human beings into animals and plants. When Ceyx, a son of Hesperos, perished by shipwreck, his broken-hearted wife Alcyone threw herself into the sea and was drowned. The gods changed them both into kingfishers, which were said by the ancients to make their nests on the surface of the sea in winter during a short period of calm, which sailors call the Alcyon or Halcyon days. Asteria, the Titan's daughter who spurned an amour with Zeus, was transformed by him into a quail. At the death of Melagros, his lamenting sisters were changed into shrill-voiced guinea-fowl. In the Attic group of myths, Tereus became the Hope, Philomel the nightingale, and Procne the swallow, while Nissos of Megra was transformed into the sea eagle. Some instances are recorded in which human beings took the forms of quadrupeds. The impious Lycaon became a prowling wolf, Callisto a bear, and Psamathe, a wife of Iacchos, a seal. The origins of certain trees were sometimes traced back to a human or a divine personage. For instance, when Philyra first saw her monstrous son, the centaur Cheiron, she was so filled with horror that she begged to be given a new form, and Zeus bestowed upon her that of the linden tree. In pity for the innocently incestuous Smyrna, Aphrodite allowed her to become the myrrh tree with its sweet aroma. The grieving sisters of Phaethon were turned into tremulous poplars, and Daphne, as we shall see later, became the laurel. Beginnings of civilization. By means of myth, the Greeks endeavored to explain the origins of the various features of civilization as they did other beginnings equally obscure. The Argives alleged that the Phoroneus was the first to teach men to abandon a solitary manner of life and to gather together into communities. It was he, and not Prometheus, according to their patriotic claim, who was the discoverer of fire. Among the Arcadians, Pelagos was believed to have been the first to contrive huts, to fashion garments from the skins of beasts, and to instruct men to cease eating leaves and grass like the brutes of the field and to adopt a more distinctively human diet. From Arcas, the Arcadians' eponymous ancestor, men learned how to make bread, spin thread, and weave garments. To the people of Eleusis, Triptomelus was the pioneer in the cultivation of the staple grains, while the reading of the will of the gods in the flight of birds was first practiced by Paranthos, and Deucalion was credited with having been the founder of religion. The ages of the world. The Greeks and Romans, like most other peoples, believed that the world had passed through a series of ages, although the several theories as to the nature of these eons are in many respects discrepant. The cyclic theory, the theories of both earlier and later mystics, and the theories of the Stoics and Cynics, while owing much of their fabric to mythology, belong more properly to philosophy, and hence, even though a great part of their teaching is presented in the form of myth, they can justly be ignored in this account. Hesiod relates that in the beginning, the Olympians under Cronos created the race of the men of gold. In those days, men lived like gods in unalloyed happiness. They did not toil with their hands, for earth brought forth her fruits without their aid. They did not know the sorrows of old age, and death was to them like passing away in a calm sleep. After they had gone hence, the spirits were appointed to dwell above the earth, guarding and helping the living. The gods next created the men of silver, but they could not be compared in virtue and happiness with the men of the elder age of golden peace. For many years they remained mere children, and as soon as they came to the full strength and stature of manhood, they refused to do homage to the gods and fell to slaying one another. After death they became the good spirits who live within the earth. The men of bronze followed, springing from ash trees and having hearts which were hard and jealous, so that, with them, lust and strife began to gnaw the world. All the works of their hands were wrought in bronze. Through their own inventions they fell from their high estate, and from the light they passed away to the dark realm of King Hades, unhonoured and unremembered. Zeus then placed upon earth the race of the heroes who fought at Thebes and Troy, and when they came to the end of life, the Olympians sent them to happy abodes at the very limits of the earth. After the heroes came the men of iron, the race of these wild latter days. Our lot is labour and vexation of spirit by day and by night, nor will this cease until the race ends, which will be when the order of nature has been reversed and human affection turned to hatred. It is only too plain that this version is marked by an inconsistent development, and the insertion of the age of heroes between the age of bronze and the age of iron is exceedingly clumsy. Ovid shows how much more skill in the joinery of his material. In his narrative, the 4 ages of the metals pass without interruption, and for their wickedness the men of the Iron Age are destroyed, the only survivors, Deucalion and Pyrrha, becoming the parents of a new race, the race to which we belong. The basic idea of these 2 forms of the myth is that man was created pure and faultless, and fell by degrees to his present unworthy condition, this being borne out by the descent of the metals. The legend points, perhaps accidentally, to an advance in human responsibility through the series of ages, although its transition from age to age is far from clear. From the point of view of modern ethics, the story contradicts itself. But this must not be emphasized too strongly, since the original motive was apparently not ethical. The countless descriptions of the Golden Age in the literatures of Greece and Rome had a powerful influence over the early Christian delineations of heaven. The Great Flood. The Greeks shared with almost all other peoples the belief in a great flood, but the event, if it actually occurred, was so enshrouded in the haze of a remote past that all the accounts of it which have come down to us are plainly the products of the fertile imagination of the Greeks. They even attempted to fix dates for it. The flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha were synchronized by some with the rains of Coronaus of Athens and the Nyctimos of Arcadia. This particular deluge is the one of which the best myths treat, and in describing it we shall give in substance the account of Apollodorus, as being simpler and better proportioned than that of Ovid. When Zeus would destroy the men of the race of bronze for their sin, Deucalion fashioned a great chest at the bidding of his father Prometheus. Into this he put all manner of food and drink, and himself entered it with his wife Pyrrha, daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora. Zeus then opened the sluices of heaven and caused a great rain to fall upon the earth, a rain which flooded well nigh all Hellas and spared only a mere handful of men who had fled to the neighboring hills. Deucalion and Pyrrha were born in the chest across the waters for 9 days and 9 nights until they touched Mount Parnassus, on which, when at length the rain had ceased, Deucalion disembarked and offered sacrifice to Zeus Phyxios. Through Hermes, Zeus bade him choose whatsoever he wished, and he chose that there be a human race. Picking up some stones from the ground at the command of Zeus, he threw them over his head, and they became men, while the stones which Pyrrha cast in like manner became women. Hence, from a stone, men were called people. In his version, Nonnos localizes the flood in Thessaly. Besides the foregoing, there are other flood myths. Megaros, the founder of Megara, was said to have been rescued from a deluge by following the guiding cry of a flock of cranes. Dardanos escaped from a Samothracian flood by drifting to the Asiatic shore on a boat of skins. And the separation of Europe and Asia, it was related, was due to an unprecedented flow of water. Most scholars of comparative mythology now agree that the flood stories of the various peoples are germinally of local origin, and in most instances consist of genuine tradition of a wide-reaching inundation mingled with pure myth. Chapter 2. Myths of the Peloponnesus. Arcadia. Pelasgos. The first man in Arcadia was Pelasgos, after whom the land was named Pelasgia, and a fragment of Arsios says that the black earth bore godlike Pelasgos on the wooded hills, that there might be a race of men. Elsewhere he is called the son of Zeus and the Argive Niobe, and if Niobe was really an earth goddess, as we have reason to suspect, these two genealogies are in fact but one. Besides being the founder of human civilization, he was the first Arcadian king and temple builder. He was wedded to the sea nymph Meliboea, or Kylene, or Deianeira, by whom he begat a son Lycaon. Lycaon. Lycaon too was a founder who built the city of Lycosora, established the worship of Zeus on Mount Lycaeus, and erected the temple of Hermes of Kylene. He married many wives, who bore him 50 sons, but they and their father manifested such impiety and arrogance before both gods and men that they became an offense in the eyes of Zeus. In order to make trial of them, Zeus came to Lycaon's palace in the disguising garb of a poor day laborer. The king received him kindly, but on the advice of one of his sons mingled the vitals of a boy with the meat of the sacrifices and set them on the table before the god. With divine intuition, Zeus detected the trick. Rising in anger, he overturned the table, destroyed the house of Lycaon with a thunderbolt, changed the king into a wolf, and proceeded to slay his sons. When one only, Nyctimos, was left, Gaia stayed the hand of Zeus. This succeeded his father on the throne, and during his reign came the great flood which Zeus sent to destroy mankind. In this story, Lycaon may represent an old Pelasgic god or king whom immigrating Greeks found established in the land. The resemblance between the Greek word nukos, wolf, and the initial syllable of the name Lycaon may perhaps in part have given rise to the myth of Lycaon's change into a wolf. While in the impious offering to Zeus one can see a record of human sacrifice in an ancient Zeus ritual. Callisto. In addition to his 50 wicked sons, Lycaon had another child, a daughter named Callisto, or fairest, who was sometimes spoken of simply as a nymph, a circumstance which probably points to her original independence of Lycaon. She was a companion of Artemis, the huntress goddess chaste and fair, who exacted of her followers a purity equal to her own. But Zeus deceived Callisto and took advantage of her. When she was about to bear a child to him, Hera discovered her condition, and turning her into a bear, persuaded Artemis to kill her with an arrow as she would any other beast of the woodland. At the behest of Zeus, Hermes took her unborn child to his mother Maia on Mount Kyllene, where he was reared under the name of Arcas. But the slain Callisto Zeus placed among the constellations as the bear, which, never setting, ceaselessly revolves about the pole star, for Tethys, obeying the command of Hera, will not allow the evil thing to bathe in the pure waters of Okeanos. This myth, too, can be traced to a religious origin. In Arcadia, the bear was an animal sacred to Artemis, one of whose cult titles was Calliste, a name which could readily be worked over into Callisto. Callisto, then, both maiden and bear, was none other than Artemis herself. Moreover, the similarity in sound between Arcas and bear was a great aid to the development of the story without being its cause. Arcas, Aleos, Og. Arcas, though generally considered to be the son of Callisto and Zeus, was sometimes designated as the twin brother of Pan, the native god of Arcadia. One tale even makes him the child whose flesh Lycaon served to Zeus. But in this instance, Zeus put the severed members together and breathed into them once more the breath of life. The child was then reared to manhood in Aetolia and later followed his uncle Nectimos as king, the country being named Arcadia after him. Arcas wedded the nymph Erato, by whom he became the father of 3 sons who had many descendants, and even in our era his grave was pointed out to travellers near Mantinea. The 3 sons of Arcas divided the rule among themselves, and one of his grandsons, Aleos, founded the city of Tegea, where he established the cult of Athene Alea. His daughter Og, or Sunlight, had an intrigue with Heracles when he visited her city, and afterward secretly bore a son whom she concealed in the sacred precincts of Athene. About this time, a dreadful plague came upon the land, and on consulting the oracle as to the cause of it, Aleos was warned that the house of the goddess was harbouring an impure thing. After a search he found the child and learned of his daughter's sin. Enclosing mother and son together in a chest, he cast them adrift upon the sea, and by the waves they were borne at length to the shores of Mysia, whence they were led to the court of King Tethyrus, who made Og his queen and accepted her son, now called Telephos, as his own. In a variation of the tale we read that Aleos exposed Telephos on the mountainside, where he was suckled by a doe and afterward found by hunters or by herdsmen. Og was given to Neopleus to be killed, but her life was spared, and she and her son ultimately found their way to Mysia. We shall meet with Telephos later on in the story of the Trojan War. The plague at Tethys. The people of the Arcadian village of Teuthis told an interesting myth which purported to account for a visitation of sterility on their soil. The villagers had sent a certain Teuthis, or Ornithos, to command a contingent of Arcadians in the war against Troy. But when the Greeks were held back at Aulis by headwinds, Teuthis quarrelled with Agamemnon and threatened to lead his men back home. In the guise of a man, Athene appeared to him and tried to dissuade him from his purpose. But in a fit of rage he pierced her in the thigh with his spear and withdrew to Greece. At Teuthis the goddess came before him with a wound in her thigh, and a wasting disease fell upon him, while his country was stricken with the failure of the crops. The oracle of Zeus at Dodona instructed the people that if they desired to appease the goddess, they must, among other things, make a statue of her with a wound in its thigh. And Pausanias naively adds, "I saw this image myself, with a purple bandage wrapped round its thigh." Laconia and Mycene. Lelex and his descendants. The first man and first king of Laconia was Lelex, who, like Pelsagos, was autochthonous, that is, the offspring of the soil. From him the country derived its name of Lelagia, and he had 2 sons, one of whom, Miles, succeeded him in the sovereignty, while the other, Polychaon, became the ruler of the kingdom of Messenia. At his death, Miles's dominion passed into the hands of Eurotas, the largest river of the land, whose daughter Sparta became the bride of Lacedaemon. Amyclas, one of the issue of this union, begetting a famous son, Hyokinthos. Hyokinthos. This Hyokinthos was one of the chief personages in Laconian worship and myth. A model of youthful beauty, he was much loved by Apollo, and Zephyros, the mild west wind, also loved him. But since his devotion was unrequited, in an outburst of jealousy he permitted a discus thrown by Apollo in a friendly contest to swerve aside and kill Hyokinthos. From the youth's blood caught by the earth sprang up the deep red hyacinth flower, whose foliage is marked with the letters Ai, which signified to the Greeks lamentation. Long did Apollo grieve for his friend unhappily slain by his hand. The body was buried at Amyclae, where in the temple of Apollo his grave was for long years visible to passers-by. And from the mourning of Apollo was developed the great Laconian festival, the Hyakynthia, the first days of which were devoted to a demonstration of grief, while the last day was one long outburst of joy. These 2 kinds of celebration marked respectively the alternating dying and revival of vegetation as typified mainly by the hyacinth. The festival was probably pre-Dorian in origin. The family of Perieres. According to one of the genealogies, Amyclas had a grandson Perieres, or Pieres, who held the throne of Messene. By his queen Gorgophone, the daughter of Perseus, he begat 4 sons, Tyndareos, Apharios, Icarios, and Leucippos, all of whom hold prominent places in myth through the fame of their children. Icarios became the father of Penelope, the faithful wife of Odysseus, Apharios of Edus and Lynceus, Tyndareos of Helen, Clytemnestra, old spelling Clytemnestra, Castor, Polydeuces, and others, and Leucippos of Hilaria and Phoebe. Tyndareos, Helen, Castor, and Polydeuces. Tyndareos was expelled from Sparta by his brothers, and, Until restored to his kingdom by Heracles, he took refuge with Theseus, king of the Aetolians, whose daughter Leda he married. The story of the birth of his daughter Helen is variously told. The version most widely known is that which depicts Leda as a human being approached by Zeus in the guise of a swan, Helen, the offspring of this union, being therefore Leda's own child. A late version, on the other hand, represents her as the daughter of Nemesis. It seems that Nemesis, after taking various other forms in order to elude the amorous pursuit of Zeus, finally assumed that of a swan, but by appearing in the same shape Zeus deceived her. After the manner of birds she laid an egg, which was found by a peasant, or by Tyndareus, and taken to Leda. In due time Helen emerged from the egg, and was cherished by Leda as of her own flesh and blood. When she was nearing womanhood, her parents sent her to Delphi to inquire of the oracle concerning her marriage. One day, while the response was being awaited, she happened to be dancing in the temple of Artemis at Sparta, when Theseus of Athens and his friend Perithous suddenly appeared and seized her. The two drew lots for her possession, and she was given to Theseus, who carried her off to Attic and left her in charge of his mother Aethra in the mountain village of Athene. Helen's brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, thinking that she was at Athens, went thither and demanded her release, only to meet with refusal. Not long afterward, however, when Theseus departed for a distant country, the brothers learned of the place of Helen's concealment, and by a sudden attack succeeded in carrying her home along with her custodian Aethra. The citizens of Athens, alarmed at the military demonstration of Castor and Polydeuces, admitted them into their city and thereafter accorded them divine honors. This myth we can probably put down as a fiction to account both for an early clash between Athens and Sparta and for the introduction of the worship of Castor and Polydeuces into the city first named. On returning to her home after this, the earliest of her many adventures with men, Helen and her parents, particularly the latter, as we may readily surmise, were much perplexed by the importunity of a multitude of suitors for her hand. It was decided that the matter be settled by lot, but before the lots were cast, Tyndareus, fearing trouble from those of the suitors who would be doomed to disappointment, shrewdly persuaded them to consent to swear that they would one and all defend Helen and the successful suitor in the event of her being wronged in the future. They took their oaths over the severed pieces of a horse, and the oaths were bound, as magic terms it, by the burial of the pieces. By the lots, Helen became the wife of Menelaus of Argos. Her later adventures belong to the story of the Great Trojan War. Helen's twin brothers, Castor and Polydeuces, were known jointly as the Dioscoroi, sons of Zeus, although it was popularly believed that only Polydeuces was in fact the son of the god, Tyndareus being the father of the other. These brothers were conspicuous figures in Spartan cult and myth, and were regarded by the ancient Greeks in general as the outstanding exponents of heroic virtue and valor. So faithful and deep was their affection for one another that their two personalities were blended as into one, and thus they stood as the divine guardians of friendship. They excelled in athletic sports and feats of arms, Castor being the type of expert horseman, and Polydeuces that of the skillful boxer. While to the accomplishment of Athene's flute they are said to have invented the Spartan military dance. Their altar stood at the entrance to the hippodrome at Olympia, and they appeared frequently on the heroic stage. They participated in the voyage of the Argonauts and in the great hunt at Calydon, and at Sparta they fought against Enarsophros, the son of Hippocon. But their chief military exploit was their sanguinary encounter with their cousins Idas and Lynceus, the sons of Aphareus. This story is told in two distinct forms. In one, the two pairs of brothers were making raids on the cattle of Arcadia. Idas and Lynceus were driving a captured herd into Messenia when they almost fell into an ambuscade led for them by Castor and Polydeuces. These latter had hidden themselves in a hollow oak, but they could not elude the keen eyes of Lynceus, who was able to see through the hearts of trees and beneath the surface of the earth. Lynceus attacked Castor and killed him, but Polydeuces swiftly pursued his brother's slayer and struck him down, as he was about to roll upon him the images of Hades, which stood on Aphareus' tomb. Suddenly Zeus intervened and smote Idas with a thunderbolt, which consumed the bodies of the slain brothers together. Whereupon Polydeuces prayed Zeus to be reunited with Castor, obtaining an answer in the divine permission, ever afterward to live with him alternately on Olympus and in the underworld. In its other form, the story depicts the brothers of each family as rivals for the hands of their two cousins, the daughters of Leucippus. The sons of Tyndareus seized the maidens and carried them off, pursued by the sons of Aphareus, who kept taunting them with having violated the custom of the country by withholding marriage presents from the bride's parents. In reprisal, Castor and Polydeuces appropriated their pursuers' cattle and gave them to Leucippus, the consequence being a double duel in which Castor killed Lynceus, and then Idas slew Castor for his insults to the dead, and lastly Polydeuces killed Idas. After this, the sons of Tyndareus were vouchsafed immortality, as in the first version of the myth. Their significance in cult, together with that of Helen, will be explained in our consideration of the divinities of light. Idas and Lynceus are to be regarded as the Messenian doubles of the Dioscuri. Idas and Marpessa. Evenos, the uncle of Leda, had a daughter Marpessa. Both Apollo and Idas, enamored of her beauty, became her suitors, and the latter in his passionate love seized her and bore her away in a winged chariot, the gift of Poseidon. Eluding the pursuit of Evenos, he brought her to Messene, where Apollo attempted to wrest her from him, and would have worked his will had not Zeus interrupted the quarrel and bidden the maiden choose between the rivals. Marpessa, fearing that the fickleness of Apollo in the past was a poor promise of fidelity in the future, chose the mortal suitor Idas. If I live with Idas, then we two on the low earth shall prosper hand in hand, in odours of the open field, and live in peaceful noises of the farm, and watch the pastoral fields burned by the setting sun. And he shall give me passionate children, not some radiant god that will despise me quite, but clambering limbs and little hearts that err. When she had spoken, Idas with one cry held her, and there was silence, while the god in anger disappeared. Then slowly they, he looking downward, and she gazing up, into the evening green wandered away. Argos. The land of Argolis was so situated in relation to the main highways of navigation in the Mediterranean as to invite a great variety of foreign connections. In this one may find an explanation of the motley fabric of Argive myth, and a careful study of its composition makes it possible to state with some degree of assurance the sources of its sundry elements. Naturally, it is outside the scope of this work to tag such constituent tale of the narrative with its national origin. Suffice it to say that we find a nucleus of native Argive myth overlaid in an irregular fashion with legends of Cretan, Euboean, Boeotian, Milesian, Corinthian, Megarian, and Aetolian provenance, which, regardless of the question of their origin, are nearly all fraught with interest for the student of comparative religion and custom. Inachos, Io. The first figure in the purely Argive part of the complex of myths is that of Inachos, the principal river and river god of the Argolid. In the developed genealogy, he is the offspring of Okeanos and Tethys, and by a marriage with an Okeanid he begat two sons, Phoronius and Aegelius, the first of whom, also said to be an autochthon, we have already seen as one of the pioneers of human culture. Aegelius, especially prominent among the people of Sicyon, was the personification of the southern shores of the Gulf of Corinth. Phoronius had two children, Apis, after whom the Peloponnesus was called Appia, and Niobe, by whom Zeus became the father of Pelasgos and Argos. One of the descendants of Argos of the third or fourth generation was Argos Panoptes, all-seeing, a monster whose body was covered with eyes. He slew the bull which was ravaging Arcadia, flayed it, and used its skin as a garment, and he is also said to have killed Satyros as he was raiding the herds of the Arcadians, and to have trapped Echidna, the hideous issue of Tartarus and Gaia. Io, the chief personage in this group of myths, was counted either as the daughter of Inachos or of Peiron, perhaps a double of Inachos, or as a comparatively late descendant. An exact genealogy is not essential to her story. She was the priestess of the temple of Hera, the divine patroness of Argos, and her charms drew upon her the attentions of Zeus, who corrupted her, but who denied the deed when charged with it by his wife. Like a coward, he changed into white heifer the maiden whom he had wronged, and surrendered her to Hera, who put her in care of the vigilant Argos Panoptes. By him she was tethered to an olive tree in the grove of Mycenae, but at the command of Zeus, Hermes slew Argos, thereby earning for himself the title of Argeiphontes, or Argos Slayer, and set Io free, whereupon, animated by a merciless spite, Hera sent a gadfly to pursue her from land to land. She was driven first of all to the Gulf, whose name, Ionian, even today commemorates her visit, and thence across Illyrion and Thrace, whence she made her way to Asia over the straits, which from that day were called the Bosphorus, or Oxford. Through Caucasus, Scythia, and Cimmeria, or Crimea, even across the Euxine, she was goaded by the fly, until at length she reached Egypt, where she was given rest and restored by Zeus to her human form. On the banks of the Nile she bore a son, Epaphos, or Touch, to the god. But the presence of the babe was offensive to the jealous spirit of Hera, and through her machinations Epaphos was taken from his mother and hidden in a far land. Again the distressed Io was compelled to wander on the face of the earth, until, after a long search, she found her son in Syria and brought him back to Egypt, where he became the forefather of several great peoples. The suggestions put forth to account for the myth of Io are many and varied. Most of them try to identify both her and Argos with celestial phenomena. For instance, Io is the moon with its horned crescent wandering across the sky, and her guardian Argos is the starry heavens. Such suggestions as these, however, fail to satisfy the profoundest student of folklore, since they do not even attempt to give a reason for the sentiment, almost akin to reverence, with which the Argives regarded the person of Io. The Heraion, the temple of Hera near Argos, was doubtless the source of the earliest form of the myth, and probably Io was none other than Hera herself, who elsewhere is said to have assumed the form of a cow. At all events, the cow was sacred in the cult of Hera. The tale of Io's wanderings is apparently a late addition brought in form outside when the original theme assumed new forms among the alien tribes and cities which had dealings with Argos. The families of Danaus and Aegyptos. Belos, a grandson of Epaphos, ruled over Egypt, and by a daughter of the Nile had 4 sons, in only 2 of whom, Danaus and Aegyptos, we are interested at present. The latter was appointed king of Arabia by his father, but by conquest he added to his realm the country of the Melampodis, or Blackfeet, which he named Aegyptos, or Egypt, after himself. He had a family of 50 sons, and his brother Danaus, the sovereign of Libya, the same number of daughters. The 2 brothers became involved in a political quarrel, and Danaus with his daughters fled by ship to Argos, whose king Gilanor yielded the crown to him, thus restoring it to the line of Io. As it happened, the land had been without sufficient water since the time when Poseidon had dried up the springs and streams to punish Enachos for his award of the divine supremacy of Argos to Hera. But one of Danaus's daughters, Amymone, gained the love of Poseidon and through him received knowledge of the abundant springs of Lerone, which thenceforth were a perpetual blessing to the land and to the people. Presently the 50 sons of Aegyptos appeared in Argos and demanded their 50 cousins in marriage. Though distrusting them, Danaus acquiesced in their demand, but secretly he gave to each daughter a weapon with which she was to slay her husband at the earliest opportunity. And on their wedding night, all except Hypermnestra stabbed their bridegrooms to death in bed. For her disobedience, Danaus imprisoned Hypermnestra, but later, relenting, allowed her to live with her husband Lynceus, while her sisters buried their husbands' heads in the spring of Lerone and interred the bodies before the city. In compliance with the behest of Zeus, Athene and Hermes cleansed them of the guilt of bloodshed, after which Danaus held a series of athletic contests, to the winners of which he gave his widowed daughters in marriage. In an older form of the myth than that which we have just outlined, Lynceus immediately avenged the murder of his brothers by killing not only the guilty daughters, but Danaus as well. In Hades, these women were condemned to the endless task of filling a bottomless jar with water drawn in leaky vessels. This myth is a strange conglomerate of primitive magic and cult. It seems to be in part of an aetiological character, and to purport to reveal the origin of the ritual of a rain charm which had somehow become associated with the cult of the dead. In this ritual, a bottomless jar would be placed over the grave of one who had died young or unmarried, and the liquids poured into the vessel passed forthwith into the ground and to the souls of the dead, the thirsty ones, who would put an end to the drought as soon as their own thirst should be satisfied. In all probability, Hypermnestra was was a priestess of Hera in her capacity of goddess of wedlock, and thus constitutes a link binding this myth with those emanating at an earlier period, and more directly from the Heraion. The connection of Amymone and the springs of Lernae with the myth of the Danaids cannot be original. Prometheus and his daughters. On the death of Danaus, his son-in-law Lynceus became king. He had two grandsons, Acrisius and Prometheus, who were said to have fought with one another even before birth, so early did a quarrel over the succession arise between them. When they became men, Acrisius got the upper hand and exiled his brother, who went to Lycia in Asia Minor, where he was hospitably received by King Iobates and was given the Princess Anteia, or Stenobia, in marriage. With the aid of a Lycian army he returned to the Peloponnesus, captured Tiryns in spite of its strong fortifications, and there established his rule. His wife bore him 3 daughters, who in young womanhood were stricken with madness, either for refusing the rights of Dionysos or for treating an image of Hera with contempt. Raving wildly, they roamed throughout the land, until Melampos, or Blackfoot, that is Egyptian of Pylos, a seer skilled in the use of healing drugs, promised to cure them on condition that Prometheus surrendered to him 1/3 of the kingdom. This Prometheus refused to do, but meanwhile the evil grew, for the other women of the country were becoming infected with the madness. The seer renewed his promise of healing, this time with the added condition that a 2/3 of the kingdom go to his brother Bias. At last Prometheus yielded, and his daughters were made whole by means of Bacchic rites. Bias wedded one of the 2 younger maidens, and Melampos the other, by whom he became the founder of a family of seers. The instructive feature of this myth in its revelation of 2 strata of cults in primitive Argos, the earlier that of Hera, the later that of Dionysos. The alleged impious acts of the daughters of Prometheus seem to serve as explanation for certain wanton words and rites in the worship of these 2 gods in historical times. With this story, we may compare a Boeotian legend which records the madness of the daughters of Minyas. Acrisius, Danae, and Perseus. Acrisius, who continued to hold sway over Argos, was told by an oracle that his daughter's son would kill him. To circumvent the prophecy, he enclosed his daughter Danae in a brazen chamber, thinking thereby to cut her off from all human intercourse. But he failed in his purpose, for, as some say, the maiden was corrupted by her uncle Prometheus, or, as others claim, by Zeus, who won his way to her in the form of a shower of gold falling through an aperture in the roof of her prison. When she had given birth to a son, whom she called Perseus, Acrisius put them both in a chest and sent them adrift on the waters of the Aegean. By wind and wave the chest was carried to Seriphos, where it was dragged ashore by Dictys, the brother of Polydictys, the king of the island, who released Danae and her child and gave them a home. After a number of years, Polydictys made love to Danae, but was rejected. Fearing to take her by force, since Perseus was by this time quite capable of defending his mother, he devised a plan to get her son out of the way. To all his friends he sent invitations to a wedding feast, and Perseus, with the extravagant assertion of youth, replied that he would not fail to be present, even if he had to bring the Gorgon's head. When the guests had assembled, and it was discovered that all of them except Perseus had brought horses as presents, Polydictys dismissed him until he should have fulfilled his promise to the letter, warning him, moreover, that in event of failure his mother would be wedded by force. Sadly, Perseus withdrew to a lonely spot. But in the midst of his perplexity, Hermes and Athene appeared and led him to the Graeae, the ancient daughters of Phorcys and Ceto. These had been grey from birth, and had amongst them only one eye and one tooth, which they used in turns. By getting possession of these indispensable members, and by threatening to keep them, Perseus compelled the Graeae to tell him the way to the dwelling place of the nymphs who guarded the dogskin cap of Hades, the winged sandals, and the magic pouch. Following the directions given him, he made his way to the nymphs and secured the objects which he so much desired. With the sandals he flew through the air to the land of the Gorgons near distant Okeanos, where he found the three monstrous sisters asleep. Their heads were covered with the horny scales of reptiles, their teeth were like the tusks of swine, and they had hands of brass and wings of gold. Their most formidable endowment, however, was their power to turn to stone those who looked upon them. Aware of this, Perseus with averted face approached Medusa, the only one of the three who was mortal, and guiding himself by the reflection of her image in his shield, he struck off her head with a single blow of the scimitar which Hermes had given him, dropping the precious trophy in his pouch. From Medusa's severed neck leaped forth Pegasus, the winged horse, which flew aloft to the house of Zeus to become the bearer of the thunderbolt and lightning. And from the wound also sprang Chrysaor, who was to be the father of the three-bodied Geroneus. It is said that Athene was witness of the Gorgon's death, and on the spot invented the flute on which she imitated the dying monster's shrieks and groans. As Perseus flew across Libya after his successful exploit, drops of blood dripped from the pouch upon the land and became the germs of a breed of poisonous serpents, this being the reason why there are so many of these reptiles in this part of Africa. Medusa's sisters on waking were unable to pursue Perseus since the cap of Hades rendered him invisible. On his return flight, Perseus found the land of Ethiopia suffering from the ravages of a great monster sent by Poseidon to punish the boast of Queen Cassiopeia that she was more beautiful than the sea nymphs. In an endeavor to appease the monster in a manner counseled by an oracle, Cepheus, the king, bound his daughter Andromeda to a rock beside the sea. And just as Perseus came, the monster was about to devour her. Moved to pity and love at the sight of her, as she cowered before the great creature, Perseus without delay forced from her father the promise that she should become his bride if he could succeed in releasing her. Approaching the monster, Perseus drew from his pouch the Gorgon's head and turned him to stone. And later, when his claim to the freed Andromeda was disputed by her uncle Phineus, to whom she had been betrothed, he treated him too in the same fashion. After his marriage he lingered many months in Ethiopia and begat by Andromeda a son Perseus, who was destined to become the parent of the Persian people. On coming back to Seriphos, Perseus found Polydectes on the point of offering violence to his mother, whereupon, summoning him and his courtiers to his presence, he turned them to stone and made Dictys king in place of his brother. The winged sandals, the pouch, and the cap he restored to their original guardians and gave Medusa's head to Athene, who attached it to her shield. After an absence of many years, Perseus returned to his native Argos with his mother and his wife. Acrisius, apprehending that the oracle might yet be fulfilled, fled to Thessaly, and while there chanced to be present at certain funeral games in which Perseus was a contestant, purely by accident the young man threw a discus so that it struck and killed his grandfather, whereupon, through remorse for his deed, he refused to go back to Argos and took the kingdom of Tyrants in exchange. From Tyrants he founded the cities of Medea and Mycenae, and in the later place Andromeda bore to him many illustrious sons and one daughter, Gorgophone, whose name commemorated her father's most famous exploit. Another story is told of Perseus, which has all the marks of great age. Dionysius came to Argos, and when bidden to depart, refused to go. Thereupon Hera, in the form of Melampus, prompted Perseus and the Argives to give battle to him and his host of Maenads and Satyrs. Grasping his scimitar in one hand and the Gorgon's head in the other, Perseus flew aloft with the winged sandals and tried to attack the god from above. But Dionysus foiled him by increasing his stature until he touched heaven. At the sight of Medusa's head, Ariadne, the wife of Dionysus, became an image of stone. And this so filled her husband's heart with rage that he would have destroyed Perseus and all the cities of his realm, with Hera as well, had not Hermes checked him by force. On becoming calm, the god recognized that the attack had been inspired by Hera, and he accordingly absolved Perseus from all blame. Whereupon the Argives instituted rites in honor of both Dionysus and Perseus. Later generations, it was said, were able to locate the graves of the Maenads who fell in the struggle, as well as the hiding place of Medusa's head. It has been suggested by one school of scholars who have the foible of tracing almost every deity back to a Cretan or Philistine origin, that Perseus sprang from a Cretan offshoot of the sun worship of Gaza, and that the story was born from Crete to Thornion of the Locrians, where Perseus was identified with Hermes and assimilated many of his attributes. A much more plausible theory holds, however, that Perseus was a pre-Dorian hero of the Peloponnesus, whose cult was so widespread as to make it necessary for the Dorian conquerors to connect themselves with him genealogically in order to maintain their supremacy among the people. The story of Perseus impresses one as being an ancient folk tale. Historically, the account of the birth of Heracles should be included among the Argive myths, but we shall prefix it to the narrative of a hero's career to which it logically belongs. Corinth. The divine patrons of Corinth. The great patron deity of Corinth was Poseidon, who gave prosperity to her mariners and traders. Yet he did not have this high place from the beginning, for when he made his claim, Helios, the sun, disputed it. Both disputants submitted their respective case to Briareus of the 100 Arms, and he awarded the isthmus to Poseidon, and Acrocorinthos, the citadel, to Helios. Sisyphus. The eldest son of Deucalion and Pyrrha was Helen, whose destiny it was to have his name perpetuated in that of the Hellenic race. One of his sons, Iolaus, the ruler of certain districts in Thessaly, had a large family of sons and daughters, the most important of whom, in the opinion of the people of Corinth, was Sisyphus, reputed to be the craftiest of men, in so real a sense that he was even as wise as a god. His gift of wisdom was at once his profit and his bane. He is said to have founded Corinth, then called Ephyra, in a corner of horse-breeding Argos, and to have seized the citadel as a base of operations for piracy and brigandage. Although, on the other hand, the statement is also made that he was merely the royal successor of Corinthos, out of Media after her flight to Athens. His skill and astuteness are reflected in the person of Odysseus, whose father he became, if we are to believe one legend, through his violence to Anticlea before her marriage to Laertes, Odysseus's traditional father. Sisyphus was credited by some with having established the Isthmian Games in honor of Melicertes, his nephew, whose drowned body had been cast by the waves on the shore of the isthmus. The account of his punishment in the underworld is twofold. In the less known form, it is alleged that it was inflicted on him for an unnatural act against the daughter of his brother Salmoneus. The better-known form has more of the characteristics of a genuine folk tale. Zeus, conceiving an illicit passion for Aegina, the daughter of Asopus, had seized her and hidden her from her father. Knowing the great wisdom of Sisyphus, Asopus came to him and promised that he would provide the lofty hill of Hyokinthos with a spring of pure water, if he would tell him where Aegina was to be found. Sisyphus promptly disclosed her hiding place as the island of Oinon, thereafter known as Aegina. But Zeus, learning of this deed of Sisyphus, in a rage consigned him to Hades and bound death about his neck. The wily Corinthian, however, turned the tables on death and shackled him so effectively that no mortal on earth could die. In the meantime, Merope, the wife of Sisyphus, was withholding from the dead the libations customarily offered to them, and thus finally forced Hades to release her husband and to permit him to ascend to the upper world. It was Hades's hope that the husband and wife would confer concerning the renewal of the libations. But he was destined to be sadly disappointed, for Sisyphus forgot to return below and remained in Corinth pursuing his former round of toils and pleasures. Hades did not gain possession of him until he was carried off by sheer old age, and to prevent a recurring of his trickery, Hades imposed on him the task at which Odysseus saw him toiling. "Yea, and I beheld Sisyphus in strong torment," said Odysseus to the Phaeacians, grasping a monstrous stone with both his hands. He was pressing threat with hands and feet to trying to roll the stone upward towards the brow of the hill. But oft as he was about to hurl it over the top, the weight would drive him back. So once again to the plain rolled the stone, the shameless thing. And he once more kept heaving and straining, and the sweat the while was pouring down his limbs, and the dust rose upward from his head. Many explanations of the derivation of the name Sisyphus have been offered, but none has any claim to reliability, the most popular being one that makes it a reduplication of the base of wise. The significance of the personality of Sisyphus is just as obscure. He has been shown to be now the restless tide, now a god of light, now a personification of craftiness, while the stone is allegorically interpreted as a symbol of the futility of human endeavor. Glaucus. Glaucus of Potniae, a town of southern Boeotia, was said to be the son of Sisyphus or of Poseidon. He became king of Corinth and was famous for the swiftness of his horses in the chariot races. In one type of the legend which concerns him, it is related that his steeds, becoming mad, as he was driving them in the funeral games of Peleus, turned on him and tore him to pieces. Causes of their madness are variously given: the deliberate act of Aphrodite, their drinking from a sacred spring, or their eating of a magic herb or of human flesh. In later years, when horses became frightened while racing during the Isthmian Games, people said it was because of the spirit of Glaucus which haunted the course. Another type of the legend says that he met his death in a collision of chariots at Olympia. Doubtless this Glaucus is a transplantation of the Glaucus of Athene in Boeotia. Bellerophon. By his wife, Eurymede or Eurynome, Glaucus begat a son Bellerophon, who, having shed the blood of a kinsman, though unintentionally, fled from his homeland to the court of Prometheus in Argos. There, Queen Stenobia was taken with a shameful passion and made advances to him. But Bellerophon utterly spurned her, whereupon, full of resentment, she slandered him before her husband, representing that she was the one sinned against rather than the sinner. Prometheus believed her story and sent Bellerophon away to the land of Lycia across the Aegean Sea, giving him a letter to King Iobates, the father of Stenobia, requesting the monarch to devise some means of putting Bellerophon out of the way. Accordingly, Iobates commissioned him to go forth and kill the Chimera, the issue of Typhon and Echidna, a dire creature, part lion, part dragon, and part goat, which was devastating the land and with a breath of fire was consuming all those who ventured to attack her. Undaunted by the danger, Bellerophon mounted Pegasus, the winged horse, flew high above the monster, and shooting down upon her laid her low, after which he returned unhurt to Iobates. Still determined to carry out his plan, the king sent him out again, first against the Solimoi, and later against the Amazons. But once more Bellerophon came back unharmed, having not only accomplished his tasks, but also having slain a band of young Lycians who had laid in wait for him. Disarmed by admiration, Iobates now ceased his plotting against Bellerophon's life, and revealing to him the contents of Prometheus's letter, asked him to take up his abode in Lycia, which he gladly did. Later he wedded the princess Philinoi, and on Iobates' death came to the throne. Elated by his successes, it is said, he essayed to ride Pegasus to heaven, but fell from his mount at a great height and was killed. The Chimera seems to have been a storm divinity who acquired her development in the primitive belief that windstorms originate about volcanic heights. Of the birth of Pegasus we have already spoken. The credulous Hesiod tells us that he derived his name from having been born near the springs of Hyokinthos. It was through a miracle that he came into the hands of Bellerophon, for in a dream Athene appeared to the young man and gave him a bridle which he found at his side when he awoke. In gratitude he erected an altar to the goddess and then approached Pegasus, over whom the bridle seemed to cast such a spell that the horse was easily subdued. Another story describes Bellerophon as finding Pegasus drinking at the spring of Peine on the Acrocorinthos, and as catching and mounting him by main strength. After the death of his rider, the horse, being of divine descent, flew upward to the ancient stables of Zeus, where he was harnessed to the thunder car. Once he returned to earth, the poets say, and on Helicon, the Boeotian mountain of the Muses, created the spring of Hippocrene, horse's fount, with a blow of his hoof. Since then he has been associated with the Muses and their arts. The development of Pegasus as a mythological figure is one of the most interesting, and is comparatively easy to trace. In the Homeric epic, Bellerophon achieved his exploits without him, but by the time of Hesiod, the two were inseparably linked, Pegasus having by that time a general and not merely a local import in myth. Not until Pindar do we find any demonstrable evidence of his being endowed with wings. A theory has been advanced to the effect that his mythological growth was due to the influences of the winged horses of Assyrian art, which reached the Hellenes through the medium of the Phoenicians, in which event the rule that archetypes tend to take their forms from myth would be reversed. Perhaps Pegasus originally stood for the rain-bearing clouds which rise to heaven and bring the lightning and the thunder. The Corinthians had other tales to explain the genesis of their famous springs. Peirin was at first a woman who was changed into the spring through the 3 tears which she shed for her son accidentally slain by the arrows of Artemis, and the spring into which Glauca threw herself to quench the flames caused by Medea's drugs was afterward known by her name. Chapter 3. Myths of the Northern Mainland. Boeotia and Euboea. Next to Argolis, Boeotia supplied the largest body of locally developed myths. And when we say Boeotia, we must understand the inclusion of Euboea, for mythologically the two are not severed by the Strait of Euripus. It must be borne in mind, however, that the legends of the island never attained to that degree of literary organization which has immortalized the stories centering, for instance, about Thebes. The oldest cults and myths of both Euboea and Boeotia can be traced back to Crete, principally through the formation of doubles of the personages of Cretan legend, so that, for instance, the Euboean Arethusa was a copy of a Cretan model. Europe appears in Boeotia as Io, and Glaucus of Anthedon duplicates the son of Minos. The extent to which these Cretan importations were changed by Phoenician and other allied Oriental influences is one of the many unsettled points of Greek mythology. But the decline of the old Boeotian states and the rise of Argos were admittedly responsible for a large measure of modification. The first inhabitants of Boeotia. After the flood of Deucalion, Zeus, uniting with Iodema, or healer of the people, a form of Europe, became the father of Thebe, a spring nymph of Boeotia, whom he gave in marriage to Ogyges, the autochthonous king of the Ectines, said to be the first inhabitants of the land. When the entire people of the Ectines perished by a plague, their country was occupied by the Hyantes and the Ionians, who called it Ionia. Later, however, the name was changed to Boeotia after Boeotos, the son of Poseidon, or, at some age, after the cow, which Cadmos followed to the site of Thebes. With certain allowances, the latter derivation is probably nearer the truth than the other. Amphion and Zethos. The story of Amphion and Zethos, though woven into that of Cadmos, is in origin independent of it and is therefore better told separately. Antiope, the mother of these heroes, was reputed to be the daughter of Asopos, the river god, or of Nycteus, or Night. Charmed by the attentions of Zeus, she yielded herself to him. But when her father became aware of her condition, she fled to Sicyon, where she became the wife of a certain Epopeus. Nycteus, overwhelmed with the disgrace which his daughter had brought upon him, took his own life after first requesting his brother Lycos, or Light, to punish Antiope and her husband. When some time had elapsed, Lycos proceeded to Sicyon, slew Epopeus, and brought his niece a captive to Thebes. On the homeward journey, however, she gave birth to twin sons, whom she exposed on the mountainside, where they were afterward found by a shepherd, who reared them to manhood. One of them, Zethos, becoming a herdsman and hunter, and the other, Amphion, a skilled player on the lyre. In the meantime, Lycos and his wife Dirk cruelly maltreated Antiope, but by a desperate effort she succeeded in escaping from Thebes and made her way to the fastnesses of Mount Citharion, where she was hospitably received by her own sons, who of course failed to recognize her. By chance, Dirk, coming to the mountain to perform some rites to Dionysos, discovered Antiope, and in vindictive fury commanded the shepherds to tie her to a mad bull, which, when loosed, would carry her to a horrible death. Just in time, Amphion and Zethos learned that the unhappy woman was their mother. Catching the bull, they released Antiope and bound Dirk by the hair in her place, afterward picking up the mangled body and casting it into a spring which has borne Dirk's name ever since. The young men then went to Thebes, killed Lycos, took the chief authority, and built the walls of the city, Amphion charming the stones into their places by means of the sweet strains of his lyre, the gift of the Muses. According to one account, Zethos married Thebe, from whom the city got its name. But according to another, his wife was Adon, who bore him a son, Itilos, whom, by a mere chance, she killed. Overcome by grief, Zethos pined away and died, while Adon was given the form of the nightingale and endowed with those plaintive notes with which she may yet be heard mourning for her son's untimely death. Amphion became the husband of Niobe, the daughter of Tantalos, and a family of many sons and daughters blessed their union. In her maternal pride, Niobe boasted that she, a mortal, had brought into the world more children than Leto, and this so incensed Leto's children, Apollo and Artemis, that Apollo slew the sons of Niobe as they were hunting on Kethyron, while Artemis killed the daughters beneath their mother's roof. Niobe fled from Thebes to her father in Asia Minor, and there, for her son's death, wept out life and breath, and dry with grief, was turned into a stone. What is said to be her form is still to be seen on the cliffs of Mount Sipylos. Cadmos. Agenor, a great-grandson of Io, established himself in Phoenicia, where he had a daughter named Europe, whom Zeus one day carried away to Crete by force. On her disappearance, Agenor sent his wife and sons throughout the neighboring lands in quest of her, and ordered them not to return without her. But all failed in their errand, and fearful of Agenor's anger, they resolved never to go back home. Phoenix settling in a district of Phoenicia, Cilix in Cilicia, and Thasos, Cadmos, and their mother Telephassa in Thrace. After the death of Telephassa, Cadmos felt free to continue his search for Europe, and going to Delphi, he inquired of the oracle concerning her. The god commanded him to cease worrying over his sister, and to turn his thoughts into another channel, bidding him to follow a heifer which he would find outside the shrine, and to establish a city on the spot where she would first lie down to rest. In obedience to the divine command, Cadmos journeyed after the animal across Phocis, until at length she sought repose beside a hill in the heart of Boeotia, and there he founded Thebes. Desiring to sacrifice the cow to Athene, Cadmos dispatched a number of his men to draw water from the rites from the spring area, but most of them were killed by the dragon, the issue of Eris, which guarded the water. Whereupon Cadmos himself slew the beast, and at the suggestion of Athene scattered the teeth broadcast over the earth as a farmer strews his grain. From the teeth sprang a host of armed men who were called Spartoi, or scattered, from the strange manner of their birth. At the sight of these warriors suddenly gathering about him, Cadmos was stricken with fear and began to hurl stones at them. And they, thinking that the missiles were thrown by their fellows, murderously set upon one another until only 5 of them were left alive. For his part in this tragedy, Cadmos was bound in servitude to Ares for 8 years. But at the end of this period, Athene bestowed the kingship upon him, and without the surviving Spartoi, he began to build up the city of Thebes. Zeus gave him in marriage Harmonia, the daughter of Eris and Aphrodite, and all the gods came down from Olympus to attend the nuptials and brought with them rare and costly gifts, Cadmos's own presents to his bride being a robe and a necklace, wrought originally by Hephaestus, which Zeus had formerly given to Europe. To Cadmos and Harmonia were born a son, Polydoros, and 4 daughters, Semele, Ino, Agave, and Autonoi. The daughters of Cadmos. Semele. Having won the favor and love of Zeus, Semele secured for him a promise that he would grant her whatever she might ask, and prompted by Hera, who appeared before her in the guise of her nurse, she requested that her lover would show himself to her in the form in which he had paid court to Hera. Bound by his promise, the Olympian entered her chamber in a chariot amid the flashing of lightning and the roaring of thunder. But, being a mortal, Semele could not endure this terrible wooing and died. From her body Zeus took their unborn child and sewed it in his thigh, where it remained for 3 months, at the end of which time he loosed the stitches and brought it forth to the light. The child, who was none other than the god Dionysos, was entrusted to Ino and her husband Athamas, a son of Iolaus, to be reared. For their care of him, the vindictive Hera visited on them a plague of madness. But Zeus saved Dionysos by changing him into a kid and secretly conveying him to the nymphs of Mount Nysa in Asia, who in after years were rewarded with a place among the constellations under the name of the Hyades. Ino. When the madness came upon Athamas, he imagined that his eldest son Learchos was a deer and killed him, while Ino, with their younger son Melicertes in her arms, leaped from the Molorean rocks into the water of the Gulf of Megara. The body of the child was washed ashore at the Isthmus, and the Isthmian games were instituted in his honor by Sisyphus. After their death, both mother and son used to give aid to those endangered by storms at sea, and sailors knew the one as Leucothea, the white sea spirit, and the other as Palaemon, the storm lord. Autonoi. Autonoi was married to Aristaios and bore him a son, Actaeon, the gleaming one, who, under the training of Cheiron, the centaur, became an ardent huntsman. One day, when engaged in the chase of Kithairon, he chanced to see the goddess Artemis bathing in the spring Parthenios, or maidenhood. But as soon as the goddess discovered his presence, she changed him into a stag, and instilling madness into his 50 hounds, sent them in hot pursuit of him. They caught him and rent him in pieces. Then, not knowing what they had done, they wandered over hill and dale searching for their master, and found satisfaction only when they saw his portrait before the cave of Cheiron. Agave. The remaining daughter of Cadmos, Agave, became the wife of Echion, one of the Spartoi, and bore to him a son, Pentheus, who in the course of time received the kingship of Thebes. During his reign, Dionysos returned to Thebes after a long period of wandering in many lands of the east, whither he had been driven by a frenzy which Hera had inflicted on him for his discovery of the vine. And so great a power over the women of Thebes did the god come to possess, that they all left their homes and betook themselves to Kithairon to celebrate his rites. Pentheus treated this barbarous dissonance of Bacchus and his revellers with the utmost contempt, until, rashly approaching the women votaries, he got a glimpse of his mother performing some secret ceremony, whereupon, with vision distorted by a sort of divine frenzy, she mistook him for a deer, and rushing upon him, tore him asunder. Sorrowing over the evils which had befallen their family, Cadmos and Harmonia abdicated the throne and withdrew to the land of the Illyrians. By force of arms they ruled among these people for a time, and were then sent by Zeus to live forever in the Elysian fields, while their son Polydoros remained at Thebes wielding his father's sceptre. The chief import of the legend of Amphion and Zethos is that it affords evidence of the great antiquity of Thebes. Even at the remotely early time of the legend's creation, men had utterly forgotten the circumstances of the building of the city's defences. Else this would never have been explained by the miraculous power of a lyre. That the story of Cadmos contains anything of genuine historical value is far from receiving general assent. Some read in it the substantially true account of the actual settlement of Thebes by Phoenicians who came thither direct from Phoenicia. Others maintain that, on the contrary, no seafaring folk would have founded a city situated as far inland as was Thebes. Moreover, they point out that the Phoenicians' theory was unknown in Greek literature before the 5th century BC. Those who occupy a middle ground are probably closer to the actual facts. They believe that at some very early date, Thebes had extensive connections with Phoenicians, but they cannot accept them as primitive. The legend of Melicertes seems to have grown up about the cult of the drowned, but the interpretation of others of this group of myths will be more appropriately discussed elsewhere. The sorrows of the house of Labdacos, Oedipus. When Polydorus died, he left a son Labdacos, who was killed shortly after he became king, some people believing him to have been slain by a god for much the same kind of sin as that of which Prometheus had been guilty. His son Laios was banished from the realm by Amphion, but on Amphion's death he returned to assume his inherited rights. Dreadful calamities awaited him and his descendants, for he was under a curse, and to the ancients curses were as inevitable as the decrees of fate. During his exile he had carried off Chrysippus, the son of Pelops, and Pelops had solemnly cursed him with childlessness, or, should he have a child, with death at the child's hand. As ruler of Thebes he married Iocaste, or Epicaste, the daughter of Menocius, who brought him a son, thus foiling the first alternative of Pelops' curse. In order to avert the second, the parents pierced the babe's ankles and gave him to a herdsman to be exposed in the wilds of Kithaeron. But it happened that he was found by a shepherd of King Polybos of Corinth, who took him to the queen, Periboia. The child, who was called Oedipus, or swollen foot, from the swollen condition of his ankles, grew to manhood in the court of Corinth, where he was the strongest and most athletic of the youths of his circle, and aroused the envy of many, who thus found occasion to taunt him with his uncertain birth. The innuendos perplexed him, and being unable to induce Periboia to throw any light on the matter of his parentage, he repaired to Delphi and made inquiry of the oracle, which warned him never to enter his native country, else he would kill his father and marry his mother. Instead, therefore, of returning to Corinth and to his supposed parents, Oedipus harnessed his car and drove eastward through Phocis. On a narrow road he met Laios, his real father, to whom the royal herald bade him yield place. For his refusal, one of his horses was cut down, and in retaliation Oedipus killed Laios and the herald, after which he proceeded on his way to Thebes. When the news of the death of Laios came to the city, Creon, the brother of Iocaste, was appointed king. During his reign a great disaster came upon Thebes, for Hera sent the Sphinx, another of the horrible issue of Typhon and Echidna, to destroy the citizens. This monster had the face of a woman, and the body and feet and tail of a lion, and the wings of a bird. And a strange weapon of destruction was a riddle which she would put to passers-by, devouring those who failed to give the right answer. The riddle was this: what is it which, having but one voice, is first 4-footed, then 2-footed, and is at last 3-footed? After many had perished in their unfortunate attempts to solve the riddle, Creon proclaimed that the wife and the kingdom of Laios would be given to the one who should succeed. To the question of the Sphinx, Oedipus replied, "The creature is a man. For in infancy he crawls on all fours, in mature years he walks upright on 2 feet, and in old age goes as it were on 3 by the aid of a cane." When she heard these words, the Sphinx cast herself down from the cliffs, and Oedipus received the promised awards. At last he had fulfilled the 2 conditions of the oracle. For many years the life and reign of Oedipus were happy, and through his marriage with Iocaste he had 2 sons, Polyneikes and Eteocles, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. At length, however, pestilence and famine wasted both land and people, and when the oracles were consulted, their answers revealed his blood relationship to his queen. Though their sin had been committed in ignorance, Iocaste hanged herself in the anguish of remorse, and Oedipus put out his own eyes. The Thebans banished him from their city, and as he departed, his sons made no effort either to help him or to defend him. For this base ingratitude he called down bitter curses on their heads, from which they were thenceforward to suffer. For the curses of parents on children were the direst of all. With the faithful Antigone he went to Colonos in Attique, where he became a suppliant at the shrine of the Eumenides, the avenging spirits of the dead. Theseus of Athens welcomed him and afforded him a home in which to end his days in peace. After a number of days, Ismene joined the 2 exiles. When Oedipus knew that his end was near, he called his daughters to his side to perform for him the last rites for the dying, and taking them tenderly in his arms, he said, "My children, on this day ye cease to have a father. All my days are spent and gone, and ye no more shall lead your wretched life, caring for me. Hard was it, that I know, my children. Yet one word is strong to lose. Although alone, the burden of these toils, for love in larger store ye could not have from any than from him who standeth here, of whom bereaved ye now shall live your life." After uttering these words he passed away, another victim of the far-reaching curse of Pelops. The friends of Oedipus desired to bury his body in Thebes, but the Thebans, remembering the sufferings brought upon them by the much-cursed dynasty of Laios, forbade them to do so. They interred it, however, in another place in Boeotia, but when this too became afflicted with calamities, its citizens ordered the removal of the corpse. Taking it to Etanos, the friends ignorantly laid it in a shrine of Demeter. When the people of the locality discovered this, they inquired of the goddess what they should do, and received the reply, "Remove not the suppliant of the god." So they left the bones of Oedipus where they were, and gave the shrine the new name of Oedipoidion, a name which distinguished it for centuries. The sons of Oedipus and the 7 against Thebes. After the banishment of Oedipus, Creon became regent for the youthful princes, Polyneikes and Eteocles. As soon as they took the power into their own hands, they determined on an arrangement by which they would rule singly in alternate years. But this agreement, like all of its kind, was not proof against the great weakness of the human heart, the lust for autocratic dominion. Eteocles, it is said, refused to relinquish his authority at the end of a term, and a bitter feud resulted, the consequence being that Polyneikes was exiled and went to Argos, taking with him the wedding robe and necklace of Harmonia, which had apparently become the symbols of the kingship in Thebes. In Argos he made Tydeus of Aetolia, also an exile from his native land, and, impelled by the combative spirit which marked the family of Laios, engaged him in a duel. Adrastos, the king of Argos, hearing the noise of the conflict, came out of his palace to learn what it might mean, and seeing that the shield of one of the combatants bore the device of a boar's head, while that of the other was marked with a lion, he recognized the fulfillment of a prophecy which had said that he would marry his 2 daughters to a boar and a lion. So he made Polyneikes and Tydeus his sons-in-law, and pledged them his aid in restoring them to their kingdoms. One form of the story relates that the Polyneikes had left Thebes of his own free will, in order to avoid the consequences of his father's curses, and that he returned later at Eteocles' request when word of the death of Oedipus reached Thebes. It was then, this version states, that the quarrel began, which resulted in the expulsion of Polyneikes and in his affiliation with Adrastos. Adrastos, planning first of all to restore Polyneikes to his rights, called the chieftains and warriors of the land to his colours. Among those summoned was Amphiaraus, or doubly holy. But, inasmuch as he was a seer, he foresaw the ultimate failure of the expedition and the death of all its leaders, and refused to go. Polyneikes, however, had learned of a pact between him and Adrastos to decide all their mutual differences by an appeal to Eriphyle, the wife of Amphiaraus, and taking advantage of the feminine love of personal adornment, he gave her the necklace of Harmonia, and beguiled her to decide in favor of her husband's adherence to the cause of Adrastos. Full of resentment at being thus forced to join the expedition, Amphiaraus before his departure enjoined his sons to slay their mother and avenge his inevitable death. The army set out under Adrastos and 7 generals, one of whom was Polyneikes. On their way they halted at Nemea to obtain water, and there Hypsipyle, a slave woman of King Lycurgos, left the ruler's infant son, whom she was tending, and led them to a spring. While she was gone, a serpent killed the child, and Amphiaraus declared that this portended how the army would fare. Bearing the infant's body, the Argives instituted the Nemean game at his grave, and ever afterward the solemn funeral origin of the games was kept before the mind by the dun-coloured raiment worn by the umpires and emphasized by the cypress grove which in antiquity surrounded the temple. Marching to the walls of Thebes, Adrastos sent a herald to demand that Eteocles hand over the kingdom to his brother according to their agreement. Meeting with refusal, he divided his host into 7 parts under the 7 leaders, and stationed each before one of the 7 great gates of the city, within which the Theban army was similarly arranged. Before giving battle, Eteocles inquired of the blind seer, Teiresias, what the fortunes of war would be, and when the answer was given that if Creon's son, Monarchus, were to sacrifice himself to Ares, the Theban arms would be victorious, the young man, with noble devotion, killed himself before the city. Nevertheless, victory did not come immediately to the Thebans, since they were compelled to retire before the enemy within the fortifications. One of the Argive leaders, Capaneus, in the ardor of pursuit, attempted to scale the walls by means of a ladder, but for his temerity Zeus struck him down with a thunderbolt. This was the beginning of the Argive rout and slaughter. What many had been slain, both sides agreed that the fate of the city should be determined by a duel between Polyneikes and Eteocles. They fought, but since they killed one another, they left the city's future still uncertain. After this, the fighting became irregular and promiscuous, fortune steadily going against the Argives until, at last, all of their commanders, Adrastos alone survived. he owing his escape not to his skill, but to the speed of his divinely born horse Arion. Amphiaraus had been pursued by one of the enemy, but before a missile could strike him, he had been swallowed up in the earth, chariot, horses, driver, and all, and was granted immortality, while on the spot where he disappeared, the city of Harma, a chariot, was founded. With the death of Eteocles, Creon assumed the powers of king, and from his palace he sent out a decree that the bodies of the fallen foes of Thebes should be left without due funeral rites. This placed Antigone, the sister of Polynices, in a grievous dilemma. To forego the rites would mean that her brother's soul would forever suffer in unrest and would haunt the places and persons it had known in life. On the other hand, to perform these ceremonies would be disloyalty to the state. Guided by the law of the gods, she defied the law of the king, and gave rest to her brother's soul. Creon had her seized and sealed alive in a cavern, despite the pleadings of a betrothed lover, his own son Haemon. Under the denunciations of Tiresias, the king repented of his deed, but it was too late. When the cavern was opened, Antigone was already dead, and at the entrance lay the body of Haemon, slain by his own hand. At the news of the tragedy, Eurydice, the queen, hanged herself, and Creon was left alone in life, a victim partly of his own obstinacy and partly of the curse of Pelops. Adrastos too felt the same burden of duty to his dead that weighed upon Antigone. Unable to secure the bodies of the Argives owing to Creon's mandate, he called Theseus of Athens to his aid, and an Athenian army, capturing Thebes, secured the Argive dead. As the body of Capaneus lay on the pyre, his wife Ifdane threw herself into the flames and was consumed with her husband. The Epigonoi. After 10 years, the son of the 7 Argive generals marshalled another host against Thebes to avenge the death of their fathers. They were known in story as the Epigonoi, or later born, and the oracle of Apollo foretold that victory would rest with them if they could obtain Alcmaeon, the son of Amphiaraus, as leader. Tharsandros, the son of Polynices, repeated his father's strategy, and by means of Harmonia's robe bribed Eriphyle to enlist her son's aid. Under Alcmaeon, the army marched to Thebes, sacked the surrounding villages, and drove the city's defenders back behind their walls. Counseled by Tiresias that defense was fruitless, the Thebans evacuated the city with their wives and children, and founded the new city of Hestiaia, while the conquering Argives entered the gates, raised the walls, and collecting the booty, gave the best portion of it to the Delphian Apollo, the patron of their victory. Alcmaeon. Alcmaeon was now free to carry out his father's last request. But hesitating to do so horrible a deed, he sought the advice of Apollo, who bade him not to stay his hand. Feeling that he had right on his side, he slew Eriphyle, his mother, perhaps with the aid of his brother Amphilochus, but forthwith an avenging Erinis of fury began to hound him and soon drove him mad, so that he wandered from place to place until at last he came to the home of Phegeus in Sophis, by whom he was purified of the guilt of shedding kindred blood. Later on he received Phegeus's daughter Arsinoe in marriage, giving her the fatal robe and necklace of Harmonia. But it turned out that his purification was not complete, for his presence sterility to the soil of Sophis. Banished from there, he roamed about until he reached the sources of the river Achilles, where he was cleansed once and for all and wedded to Callisto, the daughter of Achilles. After some years of marriage, his wife refused to live longer with him unless he would get for her the famous Roman necklace, and to gratify her whim, he set out to secure them by craft from his former wife, but was waylaid and killed by her brothers. His death was soon avenged, for his and Calliroe's sons, Amphoteros and Acarnan, came to Sophis, slew Phidias and his family, and after depositing the wedding gifts with the god of Delphi, proceeded westward and founded the country to be known after one of them as Acarnania. The collective substance of the series of myths concerning the house of Labdacos apparently points to a historic fact that the early period of Thebes' existence was marked by a number of disturbances and calamities in the ruling families. The interpretations of sundry details are so numerous and conflicting that one cannot treat of them adequately here. Suffice it to say that the most modern school tends more and more to explain them as based on fact. For instance, the school would say that the Sphinx stands for a league of pirates and brigands who harassed Thebes and threatened its very existence until crushed by some Theban leader. And it would also take Pausanias at his word when he says that he saw all 7 of the ancient gates, although he describes only 3 of them. Aetolia. The founding of Aetolia. Endymion, the grandson of Iolaus, led the Aeolians from Thessaly and established them in the land of Elis on the western side of Peloponnesus. Wedding a nymph Iphianassa, he had a son Atiolos, who killed Apis the Argive, and fled across the Gulf of Corinth to the mountainous country of the Corites, where he continued his murderous career, and killing his hosts, took possession of their land and named it Aetolia. In the course of time he had 2 sons, Pleuron and Calydon, who gave their names to the 2 chief cities of Aetolia, and their children and their children's children intermarried until finally 2 cousins, Oeneus and Thaestos, were supreme in the country's councils. Meleagros and Atlante. Oeneus ruled over Calydon and took Athaleia, the daughter of Thestios, as his wife. Their union was blessed by a son, Meleagros, and although some said that his true father was Ares, they probably judged his parentage from his exploits with the spear. When Meleagros was only 7 days old, the Moirai prophesied that he would meet his death as soon as the brand on the hearth should be consumed. Thereupon, to prevent her child's untimely end, Althea took the faggot then blazing on the hearth, extinguished it, and hid it away in a chest. Many years afterward, at harvest time, Oeneus, while offering sacrifices of the first fruits, in some way overlooked Artemis, who, embittered at the slight, sent a huge boar to ravage the tilled land and to destroy the men and herds of Aetolia. Of themselves the Aetolians were unable to kill the beast, and Oeneus accordingly summoned the mightiest spearmen of the Greeks to engage in a great hunt, promising the skin of the boar as a reward to the one who should succeed in slaying it. From all parts of Hellas the warriors came, Castor and Polydeuces, Idas and Lynceus from Laconia and Messenia, Theseus from Athens, Admetos, Iason, and Peleus from Thessaly, Meleagros and the 4 sons of Thestios from Aetolia, and, most conspicuous of all, the huntress Atalante of Arcadia. This Atalante was of doubtful parentage, if the conflicting statements of the myths mean anything, but she was generally said to be the daughter of Iasos and Clymene. So great had been her father's disappointment that she was not a boy, that he exposed her in the forest shortly after her birth, and there she was nursed by a bear until she was discovered by some huntsman who brought her up and trained her in the chase. When she became a woman, she spent her time hunting amid the hills and valleys of Arcadia, and kept her life as chaste as that of Artemis herself. With her bow she had slain 2 centaurs, who had made a lustful attack on her, and at the funeral games of Peleus she had shown her skill and strength by throwing Peleus in wrestling. Made confident by these exploits, she appeared among the heroes as a contestant for the great boar skin. For 9 days Oeneus entertained the assembled huntsmen in Calydon, and on the 10th day the hunt began. In a short time the boar had mangled and killed a number of his pursuers. The first blow he had received was from the spear of Atalante, but it did little more than graze him, and the mortal thrust was reserved for the weapon of Meleagros. When at last the beast had fallen, Meleagros flayed it and took the skin as his prize. But his uncles, the sons of Thestios, who in the contest represented the Corites, or old Aetolian stock living in Pleuron, grudged him his lawful gain and stirred up a quarrel with him, which resulted in pitched war between the people of Calydon and the people of Pleuron. Meleagros showed himself to be as great a warrior as he was a hunter, and among his many enemies whom he killed was one of his uncles. Appalled at the act, Althea imprecated curses on his head, and sullenly Meleagros retired from the strife to his wife Cleopatra, allowing his people to fight their battle alone. In the appeal of Phoenix to the angry Achilles in the Iliad, this part of the story is forcefully told. Now was the din of foemen about their gates quickly risen, and a noise of battering of towers. And the elders of the Aetolians sent the best of the gods' priests and besought him, that is Meleagros, to come forth and save them, with promise of a mighty gift. To wit, they bade him, where the plain of lovely Calydon was fattest, to choose him out a fair demesne of 50 plough gates, the half thereof vineland, and the half open ploughland, to be cut from there out in the plain. And old knightly Oeneus prayed him instantly, and stood upon the threshold of his high-roofed chamber, and shook the mortice doors to beseech his son. Him too his sisters and his lady mother prayed instantly, but he denied them yet more. Instantly too his comrades prayed, that were nearest him and dearest of all men. Yet even so persuaded, they not his heart within his breast, until his chamber was not hotly battered, and the Corites were climbing upon the towers and firing the great city. Then did his fair girdled wife pray Meleagros with lamentation, and told him all the woes that come on men whose city is taken. The warriors are slain, and the city is wasted of fire, and the children and the deep-girdled women are led captive of strangers. And his soul was stirred to hear the grievous tale, and he went his way and donned his glittering armor. So he saved the Aetolians from the evil day, obeying his own will. But they paid him not now the gifts many and gracious, yet nevertheless he drave away destruction. In this fray he slew the remaining 3 sons of Thestios, and then himself was killed. At his death his mother and his wife hanged themselves, and his sisters, as they mourned over his body, were changed into guinea fowl. There is another and later version of the sequel of the boar hunt. In this, Meleagros, fascinated by the charms of Atalante, gave the skin to her, though his uncles openly resented its bestowal on a woman, especially on one outside the pale of their own family. Finally, they seized Atlante and wrested her prize from her. But in chivalrous anger, Meleagros set upon them and made them pay the penalty with their lives. Craving for the loss of her brothers, Althea took the charred brand from the chest and burned it, and Meleagros died immediately after. The Calydonian hunt was not the last of the exploits of Atlante. According to one story, she joined the heroes in the voyage of the Argo, and in one of their battles she was wounded, but was healed by Medea. Another legend relates that she desired to go on the voyage, but was restrained by Iason. After a number of years, Atlante found her father, but when he rather abruptly tried to exercise a parent's prerogative in marrying her to a suitor, she fled from him to a refuge of her own choosing. This place afforded a straight level stretch of ground of about the same length as a stadium, and thither she invited her wooers to repair. One by one she challenged them to a race, stipulating that the man whom she should overtake would be killed, and that the one overtaking her should wed her. All those who ventured to match their speed with hers lost their lives, until a certain Melanian came to the course. Very astutely he had brought with him golden apples of Aphrodite, and as he ran he cast them behind him. In stooping to pick them up, Atlante lost so much time that Melanian won the race and a bride. Once they were wedded, they went away towards Boeotia to share the joys and freedom of the hunt together. But their happiness was short-lived, for in the flush of success, Melanian had forgotten to thank Aphrodite for her help. So, as they rested in a grotto near a temple of Cybele, the goddess threw a spell upon them both, by which they became lions and were forbidden to know the joys of mutual love. All the outstanding characteristics of Atlante, her skill with the bow and in the chase, her chastity, and her swiftness of foot, together with her early association with the bear, go to reveal her as Artemis in human form. Myths of Crete and Attic. Crete. Europe. Europe, as we have already seen in the first part of the legend of Cadmos, was the daughter of Agenor, or by some accounts, a phoenix. One day, when she was plucking flowers with her friends in a beautiful meadow of Phoenicia, Zeus spied her from afar and became so enamored of her that, in order to deceive the watchful Hera, he took the form of a grazing bull and approached the happy group of maidens. Drawing close to Europe, he cast a charm over her by his gentle manner, so that she fearlessly stroked and petted him and led her comrades in playing merry pranks with him. Further emboldened, she climbed upon his back, endeavoring to lure some of her companions after her, but before they could come near, the bull with a bound leaped into the sea and swam away with her. In answer to her tearful pleadings, Zeus at length revealed himself and his love. Continuing westward across the deep, he brought her to the island of Crete, where he wedded her and begat the heroes Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Sarpedon, while in the meantime the vain search for Europe prosecuted by her mother and brothers resulted in the final dispersal of the family of Agenor into various parts of the Mediterranean and Aegean. In the course of a few years the love of Zeus waned, and he abandoned Europe to Asterius, the king of the Cretans, who reared her children as his own. After the sons had reached adult years, they quarreled amongst themselves over a beautiful youth named Miletus, and when Minos triumphed over Sarpedon, they all fled from the kingdom. Miletus took up a permanent abode in Asia Minor and founded the city which bore his name. Sarpedon attacked Lycia and won its throne, and Zeus gave him the boon of a life 3 generations long. Rhadamanthys, who had enjoyed sovereignty over the islands of the sea, left his dominions and took refuge in Boeotia, where he became the husband of Alcmaeon. Minos remained in Crete and drew up a code of laws by which he was to gain immortal renown. The commonly accepted story relates that he married Pasiphae, the daughter of Helios, although another states that his wife was Crete, the daughter of his stepfather Asterios. A large family was born to him, the most famous of his sons being Androgeos, Glaucus, and Catreus, and of his daughters Aridne and Phaedra. Myths of Minos and his sons. Minos. When Asterios died, Minos claimed the crown, but was thwarted in his efforts to secure it, until, as a last resort, he asserted that it was his by divine right and promised to demonstrate this by eliciting the open approval of the gods. Offering a sacrifice to Poseidon, he prayed that the god would send up from the depths of the sea a bull as a sign of his sovereignty, adding the promise that he would forthwith make the bull a victim on the altar of Poseidon as a thank offering. The deity hearkened to the petition, but so beautiful was the beast which he thrust upward from the waters that Minos became greedy for it, and thinking to deceive the god, sacrificed another in its place. He gained the kingdom which he so much coveted, and, besides, the undisputed command of the great sea and its islands. But punishment was in store for him. Poseidon, remembering the attempted deception, sowed in the heart of Pasiphae an unnatural love for the bull, and drove her to consummate her desire with the help of the skilled craftsman Daedalus. But her sin became known when she brought into the world a hideous monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull, the Minotaur. Advised by an oracle, Minos shut the creature in the labyrinth which Daedalus had constructed for him. This building consisting of so intricate a tangle of passages that it was impossible for one to find his way out of it. There the Minotaur remained, feeding on the prey brought to him from all parts of Crete, until the day when he was killed by Theseus of Athens. This story, however, is best told in connection with the career of Theseus. Androgeos. The experiences of the sons of Minos were a medley of tragedy and miracle. Androgeos heard that the sea-born bull which Heracles had taken to Argolis had escaped from their territory and was ravaging the lands about Marathon. Apparently thinking that a Cretan arm was more skilled to do battle with a Cretan beast, he took ship and sailed to Attic in the hope of killing the bull. But as it happened, the animal killed him, but from his incident developed the circumstances which led, later on, to Theseus's voyage to Crete. Glaucus. The legend of Glaucus relates that when a small child, he was once pursuing a mouse and fell into a jar of honey in which he was smothered to death. Minos sought for the child everywhere, but without success, and at last he appealed to the soothsayers, who answered him in the form of a riddle. In thy fields grazeth a calf, whose body changeth hue thrice in the space of each day. It is first white, then red, and then black. He who can unravel the meaning of this riddle will restore thy child to thee alive. After Polyidos the seer had divined that the enigma alluded to the mulberry, he found the body of Glaucus in the honey jar, and Minos enclosed him in a chamber with the corpse, bidding him bring it back to life. While wondering what to do, Polyidos chanced to see a snake crawl across the floor to the child's body, and he killed it with a stone. Soon afterward he observed a second serpent come near to the body of the first, and covering it with grass, revive it. Inspired by this example, the seer did the same thing to the body of Glaucus, and to his unbounded delight beheld it slowly come to life. Minos gladly received his son back from the dead, but, in the hope of learning the method of the restoration, he ungratefully refused to allow Polydeuces to return to his home in Argos until he should reveal the secret to Glaucus. Under compulsion the seer yielded, but when about to sail away, he spat suddenly in the boy's mouth, and all remembrance of the manner of his recall to life was erased from his mind. Catreus. The story of Catreus, like that of Oedipus, clearly reveals the conviction of the ancient Greeks that it was impossible to escape from the mandates of fate. Catreus had one son, Alcmenes, who, an oracle declared, was destined to kill his father. To avoid so monstrous a deed, he fled to Rhodes. But as the years went by, Catreus felt the disabilities of age creeping upon him, and longed for his son, that he might entrust to him the responsibilities of the government. Despairing of the young man's voluntary return, he went himself to Rhodes in search of him. But when disembarking on the shore, he was met by Alcmenes, who, mistaking him for a robber, killed him. On discovering that he had fulfilled the oracle in spite of himself, the son prayed for the ground to open and swallow him up. His entreaty was heard, and the earth suddenly took him away from his companions. Deucalion. Deucalion, a fourth son of Minos, became king on his father's death, and his son Idomeneus led a contingent of Cretans against Troy. The character and achievements of Minos. It remains to say more of Minos himself, on the interpretation of whose life and person much thought and ingenuity have been expended. He has been explained as a pre-Hellenic god of Crete, a double of Zeus, as a sun god in conjunction with the moon goddess Europe, as a human representative of the Phoenician Baal Melkart, or as of the same primitive origin as the Indian Manu. Yet, the farther the Cretan excavations are carried, the stronger grows the conviction of scholarship that in the single person of Minos, mythology has compounded the chief characteristics of the powerful race of sea kings who ruled over Crete in the days which preceded the dominion of the Argives. In a certain sense, then, the tradition is correct which places him 3 generations before the Trojan War. He is not far from being a historical character. Minos is chiefly known as a ruler of powerful initiative in many fields. He founded numerous cities in Crete, the most notable being his capital, Knossos. To facilitate the administration of government, he divided the island into 3 districts, with Knossos, Phaistos, and Kydonia as head cities. And he extended his sway far out over the islands and the coasts of the mainland, and many settlements were named after him. He divided the Cretan burghers into 2 main classes, farmers and soldiers, producers and defenders. With the assistance of the people of Caria, he is said to have cleared the sea of pirates. And to enable his citizens to develop their maritime commerce, he invented a type of small coasting vessel. The code of laws which he established among the Cretans he received in the first place from Zeus, and, in order to obtain advice with reference to such modifications of it as should be necessary from time to time, he went to Mount Ida every 9th year and conferred with Zeus. In his administration of the law, his brother Rhadamanthus assisted him in the cities, and Talos, the man of bronze, in the country. But Rhadamanthus succeeded only too well, so that he incurred the jealousy of Minos and was banished to a remote part of the island. As a warrior, Minos showed himself cruel and harsh, and in conflict with his character as a just and mild ruler. Although this side of his portrait is, no doubt, coloured by Athenian prejudice. His career in arms will be narrated in the myths of Attic. Daedalus. Though a native of Athens, Daedalus is more closely connected with the legends of Crete than with those of Attic. At Athens he killed his nephew in a fit of jealousy and fled to Crete, where Minos received him in his court and encouraged his inventive genius. Among the many wonderful things which he created for the king was the labyrinth of Knossos, which we have already described. But he prostituted his ability by aiding Pasiphae in her intrigue with the bull of Poseidon, and with his son Icaros he was thrown into prison by Minos. By means of cleverly contrived wings, the two managed to escape from their confinement, the father enjoining Icaros not to fly too low, lest the wings dip in the sea, and the glue which held them together be softened, nor too high, lest the heat of the sun have the same effect. Icaros disobeyed, sought too lofty a flight, and fell headlong into that part of the Mediterranean, which since that day has been known as the Icarian Sea, whereas the more cautious Daedalus flew safely to the Sicilian city of Camicos, whose king Cocalos secretly gave him protection. Thither Minos followed by ship, and restored to a shrewd device to find out if Daedalus were really there. Showing Cocalos a snail shell, he told him that a great reward would be bestowed upon the man who could put a linen thread through its coils. Whereupon Cocalos gave the shell to Daedalus, who pierced it, tied a thread to an ant, and sent it through the hole, drawing the thread behind it. Minos, knowing that only Daedalus could have done this, demanded that Cocalos surrender him. But this the Sicilian king would not do, though he consented to entertain Minos in his palace. One day, when the Cretan ruler was bathing, the daughters of Cocalos suddenly appeared and killed him by pouring boiling pitch over him. His followers buried his body and erected a monument over the grave, founding the city of Minoa in vicinity. Daedalus is probably to be regarded as the representative of the artists and artisans of the later Minoan or Mycenaean age. One of the highly prized relics preserved in the temple of Athene Polius on the Athenian Acropolis was a folding chair said to have been fashioned by his hands. Of images attributed to him, Pausanians say that they are somewhat uncouth to the eye, but there is a touch of the divine in them for all that. Attike. The body of Attic myths is a relatively late creation. Careful study of it shows that its component parts were drawn from many different local Hellenic sources, and that the process of weaving them together was long. But just what this process or processes it may be will probably never be more than the object of conjecture. It is enough to say that the evidences point to an abundance of both conscious and unconscious imitation of other bodies of myth at various periods, to a deliberate fabrication of genealogies, and to the naive issuance of stories to account for rituals whose meanings had been lost in a dark past. But it is difficult to cite with certainty even a few instances of these, for there is a great gulf, as yet only precariously bridged, between the historical cults of Attic and the earliest period of which we have any religious remains. Cecrops. The early genealogies were, even to the ancients, a weird tangle, containing as they did many acknowledged double appearances, not a few dummy personages, and patent inversions of time relationships. Cecrops, who was commonly accepted as the great original ancestor of the Athenians, was reputed to have been born of the soil, and was regarded as being part man and part serpent. The most recent scholarship regards him as a form of Poseidon, the sea god, imported from the east and later identified with the native agricultural divinity Hyokinthos. Cecrops became the first ruler of Attic and changed its name from Acte, or seaboard, to Cecropia. During his reign, Poseidon came to Athens and with his trident struck a spot on the summit of the Acropolis, whence gushed forth a spring of salt water, afterwards sacred to Poseidon and known as the sea. Poseidon was now the supreme divinity of the kingdom, but Athene soon came and wrested the supremacy from him. To bear legal witness to her conquest, she summoned Cecrops, or as some say, the citizenry of Athens, or the circle of the Olympians. And as material evidence of her contention, she planted on the Acropolis near the salt spring the long-lived olive, which was to be the mother tree of the Attic orchards. The witnesses awarded the dominion to Athene, whereupon Poseidon, angry at being dispossessed, covered the fertile plain of Attic with a flood. Cecrops now wedded Agraulos, the daughter of Actios, to whom some mythographers assigned the first kingship, and they had 3 daughters, Agraulos, hers, or dew, or offspring, and Pandrosos, all bedewing, and a son, Eryxton, a shadowy personality, who died childless. Eryxtheneus. On the death of Cecrops, Cronaus, another son of the soil, and the most powerful of the native chieftains, became king, and when Atthis, one of his daughters, died, he attached the name of Attic to the country as a memorial to her. In his reign the flood of Deucalion occurred, and then came a series of dynastic changes. Cronaus was driven from the throne by Amphictyon, also a son of the soil, and Amphictyon was expelled in his turn by Eryxtheneus, whose father was Hephaestus, and whose mother was either Athene, Earth, or Atthis. The legend which makes him the son of Athene relates that without the knowledge of the other gods, she placed him as an infant in a chest, which she entrusted to Pandora with the injunction that on no account was it to be opened. Feminine curiosity, however, got the better of the sisters of Pandrosus, and they opened the chest, out of which sprang a serpent that killed them, or, as some said, drove them mad, so that they leaped to their death from the cliffs of the Acropolis. Athene then took the child into her own care and reared him in her shrine. And when he had grown up, he expelled Amphictyon, erected a wooden statue of his mother on the sacred hill, and established the Panathenaic festival. After his death, his body was buried in the precinct of Athene, and his kingdom was left to his son Pandion. Bootes and Erechtheus. Pandion is simply a link in a chain of genealogy. He was the father of the unhappy women, Procne and Philomel, and of 2 sons, Botens and Erechtheus, who divided the royal duties between them on their father's death, the first taking the joint priesthood of Athene and Poseidon, the second the administration of the government. Bootes became the founder of a priestly family, which continued down to historical times. Erechtheus was really a double of Hyokinthos, as is indicated by his name, which is only an abbreviated form of Hyokinthos, and thus, after a fashion, Erechtheus also was a ward of Athene. It was said that he had snake-like feet, and that to hide them as he went about among his people, he invented the chariot, and thus avoided walking, although in some sources he is described as entirely of human form. As secular leader of the Athenians, he conducted an expedition against the people of Eleusis, and in accordance with the behest of an oracle, he sacrificed his youngest daughter to bring victory to the Athenian arms. His success was indeed tragic, for though he slew Olympus, the commander of the Eleusinians, his other daughters took their own lives on learning of the offering of their sister, and he himself was killed by Poseidon, the father of Eumolpus. Of his daughter Creusa, Procris, and Orithyia became famous name in Attic myth. He was followed in order by a son and a grandson, Cecrops and Pandion, the second of whom was dispossessed of his throne by his usurping cousins, the sons of Metion. Taking refuge in Megara, he there brought up a family of 4 valiant sons, Aegeus, Pallas, Nissos, and Lycos. These, to avenge their father's wrong, invaded Attic, evicted the usurpers, and partitioned the realm amongst themselves, allowing Aegeus, however, the chief authority. The legends of the marriages and the early reign of Aegeus belong more properly to the account of the life of his son Theseus. The sons of Pandion. The war with Minos. After returning from a sojourn in Troezen, Aegeus celebrated the Pantheneaic festival. It happened that Androgeos, the son of Minos of Crete, was the victor in all the athletic contests, and as a supreme test of the young man's skill and swiftness of foot, Aegeus sent him against the bull of Marathon. But Androgeos lost his life in the undertaking. On the other hand, the authors of certain accounts state that on his way to the funeral games of Peleus, he was killed by jealous rivals who had lost to him in Athens. In either event, Minos held Athens as blameworthy for his son's death, and to punish her led a great army and fleet against her, taking Megara by storm and making Nissos prisoner. Now Nissos had growing in his head a purple hair, and an oracle had declared that as long as he retained it, his kingdom would stand. But his daughter Scylla, falling in love with Minos, plucked the hair in order to win favor, and brought about her father's fall. When Minos sailed away, she asked to be taken with him, but meeting with a refusal on account of her treachery, she threw herself into the sea and became a fish, while Nissos, in pursuit of her, was changed into a sea eagle. Lycos, a third son of Pandion, was credited by some Athenians with having founded the famous Lycaon in Athens. Athens herself held out against all the assaults of Minos, until finally he appealed to Zeus to visit vengeance upon the city, and the gods sent famine and pestilence to do what human efforts could not avail. The Athenians sacrificed 4 maidens over the grave of Gerastios, but still their troubles did not abate, and at last they yielded and accepted the terms of Minos, who cruelly exacted that each year Athens was to send to Crete 7 unarmed youths and maidens to be the prey of the Minotaur. From this dreadful tribute the Athenians suffered until released years afterward by Theseus. The daughters of Cecrops. Agraulos, one of the 3 daughters of Cecrops, became the wife of Eris, and by him the mother of a daughter, Alcippe, who, while still a mere girl, was shamefully attacked by Hyokinthos, a son of Poseidon. Ares promptly killed the offender, and, on the appeal of Poseidon, was tried before a tribunal of the gods on a rocky eminence at the foot of the Acropolis, being acquitted, as it were, on the strength of the unwritten law. After this, the Athenians, essaying to follow the divine example, established a criminal court on the same spot and designated it Areopagos, Hill of Ares. The two sisters of Agraulos, Hers and Pandora, were both united in wedlock to Hermes, by whom the one became the mother of the beautiful Cephalus, and the other bore Chryx, the forefather of a great Athenian family. The daughters of Pandion. When war broke out between Athens and Thebes over the question of the marchlands, Pandion asked Tereus, son of Ares, to come from Thrace to help him. By means of his assistance he won the war, and as a reward gave him his daughter Procne. But after a few years of married life, the love of Tereus cooled, and a passion for his wife's sister Philomel mastered him. He told his sister-in-law that Procne was dead, and professed so warm a love for her that she consented to become his wife. But it was not long before she discovered his trickery. Wherefore, lest she tell her story to the world, Tereus cut out her tongue and confined her in a solitary place. Notwithstanding his precautions, she wove a message into a garment and sent it to her sister. After a long search, Procne found Philomel, and together they devised a revolting revenge on Tereus, in pursuance of which Procne, inviting him to a banquet, set before him the flesh of their own son Itys. The sisters then made haste to fly from the land, but Tereus overtook them in Phocis, and as they piteously prayed the gods for escape from their ruthless pursuer, they were all changed into birds, Procne becoming a nightingale, Philomel a swallow, and Tereus a hoopoe. The ancient Athenians, accordingly, used to say that the sweet plaintive song of the nightingale was the wail of Procne for her unhappy Itys. The resemblance between this story and that of the Boeotian Aedan and Itilos needs no pointing out. In reference to a similar story, Pausanias remarks, with the naivete of a child, that a man should be turned into a bird is to me incredible. The daughters of Erechtheus. Creusa. Creusa found favor in the eyes of Apollo and bore him a son named Ion. But, keeping her secret to herself, she abandoned the child and married Xuthos, an Athenian soldier of fortune. As it happened, Ion was found and was placed in the temple of Apollo at Delphi as an attendant. Together, Creusa and her husband went to Delphi to seek the advice of the oracle in reference to offspring, and received a response which Xuthos interpreted to mean that Ion, whom they met in the temple, was their child. In a fit of jealousy at the readiness of her husband to adopt one whom she secretly felt could not be his offspring, she made an attempt to poison Ion, who was saved by a mere accident. Roused to revenge, he formed a plan to murder her, but his intention was happily frustrated by the Pythian priestess, who, in the nick of time, produced the trinkets and clothing that had been found with him. And Creusa, recognizing by these that he was the son whom she had borne to Apollo, took him into her home. Afterward, she and Xuthos were blessed with a son, Achaeus. If we're to accept a different account from the foregoing, Ion, and not Cecrops, succeeded Erechtheus as king of Attic and became the founder of the Ionian stock, Hyrcanus and his descendants being later overshadowed by the family of Aeon, because Hyrcanus was not of divine blood. Procris. At the time when Procris and Cephalos became husband and wife, they pledged themselves to conjugal fidelity with more than ordinary solemnity. Now Cephalos was a hunter by occupation, and of comely countenance and form. Early one morning, when he was scouring the Attic hills for game, Eos, or Dawn, spied him, and drawn by his charms, asked of him that he would give her his love. Bound by the ties of affection and of his oath, Cephalos refused her. But the passion of the divinity was not to be denied. Slyly insinuating that under like circumstances Procris would be less scrupulous than he, she gave him the appearance of a stranger, and then, bestowing on him lovely gifts such as pleased the heart of woman, suggested that he make trial of his wife's fidelity. To his surprise, Procris weakened at the sight of the gifts, but when he resumed his real form, she became ashamed and fled away to Crete. There she wished to follow Artemis in the hunt, but the goddess would have none of her in her chaste company. Breaking into tears, Procris told Artemis of the wicked deceit practiced on her, and in pity the divinity gave her a never-erring hunting spear, and a dog, Lilaps, which never missed its quarry. Disguising herself as a youth, Procris returned to Attic, and winning the attention of Cephalos through her prowess with the gifts of Artemis, promised him that she would give them to him in return for his affection, saying that neither gold nor silver could buy them from her, but only love. At that he granted her desire, and forthwith she became her own old self, and their former relations were resumed. Procris was still fearful of the wiles of Eos, however, and one day she hid in a thicket near her husband as he was hunting in order to spy on her beautiful rival. Cephalos, seeing a movement of twigs and thinking that it was caused by some beast, hurled his javelin, which, according to its nature, flew straight to its mark. But, to his dismay, he discovered that the quarry he had so slain was his own dear wife. A second form of the story differs from this in several details. Bribed by the glitter of the golden crown, Procris surrendered herself to one Teleon, and, when detected by her husband in her sin, took refuge at the court of Minos. Minos, too, made love to her, for Pasiphae had so bewitched him with a certain drug that he could not escape a passion for every woman whom he met, a passion which was bound to work evil for both lovers alike. By the use of a magic antidote, Procris freed him from the spell, and in gratitude Minos gave her the spear and the dog. Nevertheless, apprehensive of some evil design on the part of Pasiphae, she made her way to Attic and patched up her former alliance with Cephalos. One day, as they were hunting together, he slew her by mistake with her own javelin, whereupon, appearing before the court of Areopagus, he was adjudged guilty and banished for life from the bounds of Attic. His exile coincided in time with his receipt of a request from Amphitryon that he go to Thebes with his unerring hound, and rid the country of the she-fox that was ravaging the crops and people. This animal's life seemed to have been protected by a charm, so that none could take her, and each month the Thebans used to send a youth to her for her to devour. Cephalos, bribed by the offer of a portion of Taphian booty, went to Thebes and put his dog on the trail of this ravenous beast. But the dog never overtook her, for in the midst of the pursuit, Zeus changed them both to stone. Cephalos was given his reward, however, and withdrew to a western island thenceforth to be known as Kephallonia, where, brooding over his unhappy love, he committed suicide by throwing himself from the white cliffs of the island. The chief figure in the original story seems to have been only Kephalos, Procris being a later addition. The legend arose from the very ancient expiatory ritual in which a human being bore the burden of sin to be expiated, and leaping into the sea, was drowned. Oreithyia. Oreithyia, the remaining daughter of Erechtheus, was once playing with her companions on the bank of the Ilissus, or, as one source of the myth states, was on her way to the Acropolis to sacrifice to Athene, when Boreas, the north wind, suddenly seized her and carried her off to his home in Thrace. There he forced her to wed him, and she bore to him 2 winged sons, Zetes and Calais, who afterward sailed on the Argo and were killed in the pursuit of the Harpies. The substance of this legend was not originally a product of the Attic fancy. Rather, it is an embellishment of a widespread belief that in the turmoil of the storm the passionate wind god seeks his bride. Perhaps to the Athenian, Oreithyia represented the morning mist of the valley lands, driven away by the strong clear winds of day. Boreas and Oreithyia also had 2 daughters, Cleopatra and Kinoe, or Snow White. The former married Phineus, to whom she bore 2 sons, but her husband grew tired of her and formed an alliance with Idaia of Troy, by whose heartless wiles he was persuaded to put out his children's eyes. This crime was never forgotten throughout Hellas, and with the help of Boreas, the Argonauts visited on Phineus a dreadful punishment. Chion became closely associated with Attic through her descendants. After a clandestine amour with Poseidon, she gave birth to a son, Eumolpos, or sweet singer, whom she cast into the sea in fear of her father. But Poseidon rescued him and had him cared for in Ethiopia until he had attained manhood. For a foul crime against hospitality, Eumolpos was forced to leave this country, and with his son, Ismaros, was received into the home of a Thracian king, where, too, he showed himself ungrateful for kindness, and plotted against his host. Leaving Thrace, he came at last to Eleusis, and in the war against Athens he led the Eleusinian army, and fell by the sword of Erechtheus. This latter myth contains several features which incline one to believe that Eumolpos was a figure deliberately created by the Eumolpidae, the priestly order of Eleusis, for the purpose of winning the respect which would readily come to religious orders of admittedly ancient descent. The Thracian connection of Eumolpos linked him geographically with Dionysos and increased his prestige at Eleusis.